Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Whispers. I'm aware that many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if each of you could leave a comment letting me know which part of the world you're listening from. Also, give a like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Okay, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. There are things in the woods we were never meant to find. I have seen them. There's something I need to get off of my chest. A decade-old memory. One that's always scratching at the back of my mind, like the twisted branches of a dead tree. It's a tale so harrowing that I've never told anyone about it. This story is set in a distant, desolate place called the Weeping Woods. You'll first need to understand why I was in that unspeakable place, so far from proper civilization, with 3 of my friends. We were social science students, all 4 of us. Obsessed with culture, history, myth, religion, the works. We were looking to take on an honors research project, and, naturally, we wanted it to be something big, something original. It was Jack, my closest friend, who suggested it. He was from Pennsylvania originally, specifically a town some 50 miles from the forest. He told us about the Weeping Woods. He told us about the Woodwick Walker. Of the 4 of us, Tina was the folklore junkie, so naturally she snapped at the suggestion. Come on, guys, she insisted. We'd get to do a road trip, camping, and our project all in one. And I'd bet good money that none of the other groups are going to research anything as creepy or as intriguing as what Jack just told us about. I couldn't argue with that, and I had no better suggestion. Marcus, our other friend, wasn't as eager. Spooky stuff really wasn't his thing. But he saw the rest of us agreeing and sighed. All right, fine. So we packed Jack's truck with everything we'd need to drive out of state for up to 2 weeks. Luckily for us, his Silverado was built like a goddamn dump truck. It could fit the 4 of us, all our clothes, food, additional supplies, and, most importantly, our recording equipment. Jack and I took turns driving, so the trek all the way up to Pennsylvania went by quick enough. We only stopped if we needed gas or the bathroom. Along the way, Jack told us more about the legend. The Weeping Woods are named as they are supposedly because those who escaped them were always in tears. According to who? I asked. Jack shrugged. That's just the legend. As unlikely as it sounds, the tale took hold enough that no one from my town liked to go there. He nudged his head at the rearview mirror. The reason we brought the saws and towing cables are in case the road is stopped up. The dingy old track that leads to the woods is used so little that it often ends up blocked by fallen trees. Marcus's breath hissed through his teeth. We had to choose the scariest, most backwater place in the world, didn't we? Hell yes, Tina replied. You're damn right we did. So, I asked, why were people crying? I guess it had to do with the Woodwick Walker? Sort of, Jack said. They were crying because they'd been forced to leave people behind. When asked about what had happened, they'd always have a hard time talking about it. A few gave vague descriptions of a man in the woods who was part of the forest. Oh, Tina sighed. I love this shit. Please, go on. Jack nodded. The one bit of info that solidified over the decades as the rule of the woods is this. Do not look at his face. When you encounter him, do not look up. His voice grew stiff as he explained. Close your eyes. If you can't do that, then stare at your feet. Nothing else. Jack, Marcus murmured, you got awfully serious just now. Jack cleared his throat, eyes fixed on the road. Did I? You definitely did, I agreed. Sorry, I still bug out over it a little, even all these years later. Have you been to the Weeping Woods? I asked him. I've only been to their edge. To tell you the truth, this legend scared the living shit out of me as a kid. The area around the house I grew up in was forested too, and I'd always imagined seeing him between the trees. I lifted an eyebrow. If you're damn well traumatized by this thing, why'd you suggest it for the project? The only way to overcome a fear is to face it, he said. True enough, Tina agreed. I have to admit, the way Jack talked about it during that ride got to me. Even Tina was a little more reverent about it all after that. And Marcus was so spooked, we were worried he'd jump ship and hitchhike back south. But the 4 of us pressed on. The road meandered, rose, and fell, until eventually the rainy, autumnal woodland of Pennsylvania appeared on the horizon. It was late autumn, so the pretty colors had given way for the most part to barren trees with only a smattering of rusty brown leaves left on them. We drove through Jack's town, which in itself was so backwoods that it was hard to imagine any place more far-flung. There was one diner in the whole of the place, a local spot offering breakfast on the overcast morning we'd arrived. We knew we'd be living off our camp food for the next while, so we popped in there. When we told the friendly waitress what we were up to, she stopped being nearly as nice. "You kids promise me one thing," she said in low tones. "You keep your eyes to the ground in the woods." We laughed a little at that. She didn't. I finished my food quickly, eager to get out of there. As we walked back to the truck, Jack said, "See, it's a whole thing out here." "And you thought this was a good idea?" Marcus groaned. "Relax, guys," Jack went on. "It's just a legend, a story." Tina said, "We should stop by here again when we're done camping. A recorded interview with that waitress, or any other locals who might have something to say, would be great for the project." "Hell," I said, "we ought to record an interview with Jack. He's got plenty to say too." Yeah, Jack sighed as he thumped his door shut. "Get in. We're losing daylight." "Just how far do we have to go?" I asked. 20, maybe 30 miles, Jack explained. "No one actually knows how far the Weeping Woods are. The road there's kinda what?" Marcus prodded. "It's kinda weird, you'll see." He wasn't kidding. Even the turn onto the road was decrepit. The pavement of the highway gave way to mulchy dirt, so littered with branches and fallen leaves that only Jack's trained eye could have spotted it. The road itself was derelict, a vestige of some bygone era. The way it veered and twisted was illogical. Oftentimes we felt like we were turned all the way around and going back towards the highway. And the whole way, the only real indication that we were still on the road was the tall, gnarled trees lining the track. After a few minutes of winding through, I pointed at the compass on the Silverado's dashboard display. "We've turned this way and that, yet the compass has read northwest the whole time." Jack gave a tentative nod. "The road leads northwest into the Weeping Woods, no matter what," Tina said. "That doesn't make any sense." "I told you it'd be weird, didn't I?" Jack had an edge of irritability to him now, in his voice, in the knit of his brow. "You good, bro?" I gently said. "Sorry," he sighed. "My bad, guys. This road gives me the creeps is all. I'll chill." It was just then that we rounded a dense thicket of trees and saw a massive fallen log blocking the road. "Perfect," Marcus groaned. Jack cursed under his breath, his eyes darting left and right, peering through the trees. I raised my hands. "Hey now, we've got the tools to deal with this. No biggie. I'll take care of it." Tina shuffled about before raising her DSLR camera. "Marcus and I will take a few pictures while you deal with it, and maybe a video or two." She rolled down her window. "Sounds good." I unbuckled my seatbelt, opened my door, and jumped out. The ground I fell onto would have been soft and inviting if not for the thick tree root that jabbed into the sole of my foot. As Jack clicked the ignition and shut the Silverado's engine down, the first thing I noticed in the chilly autumn evening was the silence. A deep, encompassing quiet lay over the road, broken only by the hissing of the wind as it bothered the dark leaves that had yet to fall. "Damn," I whispered to myself, not entirely certain why I felt the need to keep my voice down. A dense fog had descended on the woodland. I suppose that was dampening the forest's sounds. As I walked to the back of the truck, Jack stepped out and joined me. I told him, "I don't mind handling this on my own, you know." He shook his head. "Nah, I'll help you. It's all good." I nodded, though with how shifty he was being, I almost wished he'd have just stayed in the damn truck. In any case, we grabbed a couple saws and walked over to the log. It was the corpse of a huge tree, and several of its thickest limbs were tangled with other still living trees at the edge of the road. I gestured toward those limbs, then looked at Jack. "What do you think?" "Yeah, we saw off the big arms, the jammed ones. Then we tow the log once it's loose." Nodding, I got started. Both Jack and I went hard. The sky was dimming, though it wasn't even late into the afternoon. The grinding and zipping of our saws seemed to violate the serenity of the forest, its near-perfect silence spoiled by the sounds of men. It was awfully uncomfortable, both because of the disturbance and because getting through those limbs was a ton of work. "We should have brought a friggin' chainsaw," I chuckled. "Heh, Jack murmured in reply. It's weird, I called over the scraping of our saws. The way it feels like it's almost evening. It's overcast today, but feels like it's too dim. Yeah, that happens. Nothing unusual. Motion at the periphery of my vision turned me around before Jack had finished his sentence. I saw a pale limb, a ropey leg, vanish behind a tree. What? Jack asked. I looked at him. I saw something. Look. I turned around, pointing, and saw that the pale leg I'd seen was just the twisted trunk of a stubby tree. It hadn't vanished behind the tree. It was still there, curling away and out of sight. Hell, it didn't even look all that much like a leg. I turned back to Jack. I'm an idiot, I said with a grin. It's nothing. It's hard to see through the fog. My mind is messing with me. Jack's eyes stayed fixed on the forest beyond me. You're sure? He asked. Yeah, bro. It's nothing. I got back to sawing. Another 15 minutes droned by before we felt the tree was dislodged enough to be towed. We hooked up the towing line and revved the engine, pulled the dead tree by one end until it was out of the way. 1 sec, Jack said as he hopped back out to reel in the towing cable. It's dark, Tina pointed out. Too dark. I craned my neck down to peer past the truck's ceiling and over the treetops. The gray sky looked like what I'd expect at 7 or 8 p.m., though a glance at the dash display revealed the time to be just 1 p.m. Yeah, I muttered. Jack wasn't kidding. This place is weird. It's not too late to turn back, Marcus begged. We can pick something else and start fresh. No, Tina snapped. We've already put way too much into this. Besides, the weirder the better, right? I recorded a bit while you guys were out, explaining the situation. She lowered her voice. I talked a little about Jack's behavior, too. I turned to glare at her. Really? Of course, she said. This little psychological quandary of his may well make for this project's best anecdotes. She wasn't wrong about that. Still, it felt wrong to turn our friend into a case study without him knowing. I don't like it, said Marcus. You don't like any of this, Tina drawled. It's fine. Jack climbed back into the truck, having coiled and stowed the towing cable. Finally. Let's get going. He tossed the Silverado into gear, and we set off. The dead and mauled log that had obstructed our path floated past my side of the truck as we went. Beyond, I thought I saw another pale limb retreat behind a tree. This time I knew better than to dwell on a figment of my imagination. The road seemed to narrow as we delved farther. To be more specific, it felt as though the twisting trees flanking it leaned in more. We saw less of the sky as branches from either side of the track mingled overhead. With each turn, the fog thickened and the daylight faded. At least the road's staying clear, I said to the others as Jack flipped on the headlights. By then, I couldn't even see past the closest line of tree trunks. And honestly, I was glad. Keeping my eyes set steady on the road ahead was simpler, more calming. There's a little more to the legend, Jack said after some time. The rest of us looked at him. The victims of the walker, he explained, they're said to remain bound to the weeping woods. Their spirits. He glanced at the rear view, probably meeting Tina and Marcus's eyes. Some claim they've seen those spirits, trying to leave the woods but never able to get far. They're trapped, Tina remarked, unable to move on to an afterlife. Something like that, replied Jack. The four of us had little else to say the rest of the way. The constant rumble of the Silverado, coupled with the deepening dark, lulled us into a stupor. It was 2:45 p.m. when we reached the end of the road. As the truck pulled into the small clearing, I started. Holy shit, there's a car. Jack looked over to my side of the truck. I heard the other two shuffling as they straightened to look too. Oh God, Marcus whispered. How common is that? Asked Tina. Jack cleared his throat. Not very. Still though, there's a legend surrounding this place. We aren't the only intrepid folk to brave the weeping woods. I peered into the car. It seemed empty. Probably just someone exploring like we are. Yeah, Jack agreed. So, Tina said, this is it then. Yeah, answered Jack. Past that tree line, that's the weeping woods. Looks the same as the rest of these woods, I pointed out. It's not, Jack replied. Come on, the sooner we make camp, the sooner we can relax. He swung his door open and stepped out. Fuck me in the ass. Marcus groaned as he kicked his door open. Let's get it over with. He jumped out. Tina and I followed suit. As the others unloaded the truck, I walked over to the derelict car. It was an old Toyota, rusted all along its frame. with so much grime over its windows that it was tough to see through. There was no way that someone had been driving behind that dirty windshield. This thing had been here for a while. I placed the bottom of my palm on the window and rubbed away as much of the grime as I could. Then I lowered myself and peered inside. There wasn't anything unusual in there. Some junk on the passenger side floor, a travel mug in the cup holder, a tote bag in the back. The only thing that caught my attention was a slip of paper on the dash. I rounded the hood until I was standing over that bit of the windshield. I spat on the glass and wiped again. The slip of paper had bold handwriting in all caps that read, "Gonna look. I have to. Tell Lorena it was a crash." I backed away from the hood. The trees hissed as a gust of wind swept through the clearing. "Guys," I called. They walked over. "What is it?" Tina asked. "Read this." I waited for them each to take a look. "Oh God," Marcus whispered. Tina asked Jack, "Have people been known to come here to commit suicide? You know, like Aokigahara Forest in Japan?" Jack shook his head. "No, not that I know of. This person seriously did not come back," Marcus said. "He could have gotten lost," I offered. We all looked at Jack. He shrugged. Marcus threw up his hands. "At what point do we concede that this forest is actually dangerous?" "You're an academic, Mark," Tina said. "Do you really believe the Woodwick Walker is real?" "I'm not saying that," he spat back. "But legends arise for a reason, don't they? In this case, I'd argue that reason was to justify the dangers of this cursed place." Tina scowled to herself. Then she looked at me. "How are you feeling about all of this?" I looked from her to Marcus. "I'm more curious than scared at this point. Sorry, Mark." Tina looked at Jack. "And you?" "I want to see this through." She looked back to Marcus. "Well," Marcus groaned for what must have been the 50th time that day. "All right, whatever, let's go." As we swung on our backpacks and grabbed our other bags, the sky dimmed until it seemed only twilight remained. Jack sighed sharply, nodded at the three of us, then led the way. Into the weeping woods. I almost expected some supernatural shift in the air the moment we crossed that tree line, but it was as anticlimactic as you'd expect. If anything was off, it was the same stuff I'd already been bothered by. The extraordinary silence, the unusual darkness, and every so often, a pale limb fading into the gloom. We hiked on, our shuffling footfalls mingling with the sounds of creaking wood. Jack marked the trees as we went so that we'd be able to navigate back to the truck. "How far?" Marcus asked after some 30 minutes. However far we want, I guess," Jack answered. "There's nowhere specific for us to go?" Tina said. "Nah," replied Jack. "Once you're in, you're in. I just figured we'd go a good ways. We drove so far for this. Might as well make it count, right?" "No," Marcus rebuked. "Not right? We're stopping here." His bags thumped onto the forest floor. His backpack followed. I looked around. "Jack, is this spot okay?" "Good as any, I guess." "Then I'm cool with it. Let's make camp." The four of us got to work. It was dark enough then that we had to click on our flashlights. I raised the tents, Jack gathered firewood, Marcus got started on supper, and Tina set up some of the recording equipment. We didn't talk much for the next 20 minutes. I think we all felt the same yearning to be done with the work and settle in. It had been a long day, the type that strained the mind. We were ready to loosen up. Despite the autumn moisture over the wood, Jack managed to get a fire going at the center of camp. I pitched our 4 tents in a circle nearby, then unfolded our chairs right around the stone circle of the fire pit. Marcus placed the cooking pot by the flames, and the 3 of us sat down just as Tina finished with the tripods. The cameras and microphones held an eerie sort of vigil around camp. I checked my phone as Tina took her seat across from me. It was 4:42 p.m. I looked up, straight up, and saw faint gray light peeking through the treetops. A breeze brushed fallen leaves past my feet. Marcus asked me, "Do you have any bars?" I glanced at my phone again, then shook my head. "Me neither," he went on. My reception dropped, 1 bar at a time, starting from the moment we turned onto that winding road. "I told you guys it was going to be weird," Jack mumbled. We spoke softly for a while longer as the stew broiled. Through that time, every one of us kept looking over our shoulders. The way the darkness seeped into those woods was abnormal. By the time we grabbed our bowls and started to eat, it was pitch black beyond the nearest circle of trees. As we ate, the winds that had been hissing through the woods slowed. They'd still come every 10 or 20 seconds, but it was like the trees weren't moving in reply anymore. Instead of rustling leaves and creaking wood, I'd just hear an eerie sighing as the air wafted through. And that darkness. The dark encroached, like it was alive. The shadows past the circle of trees pushed into our modest campsite, like they were trying to get to us. But each time that dark crawled forward, a crackling of our campfire would send it back. Of course, these were my imaginings, or so I thought at the time. "That was delicious," she chirped. "Thank you, Mark." "Don't mention it." "Well," she continued, "it's probably too dark to venture out or film much of anything, and yet it's too early to hit the hay, so I suggest we just lean into the whole camping in the woods cliché and exchange ghost stories." I laughed. So did Jack. Marcus didn't. "Hell yeah," I said as I clapped Marcus on the shoulder. "Come on, Marcus, surely you've got a spooky tale or two." So we sat around our little reservoir of warmth and light and told our cheesy ghost stories. To all of our surprise, the scariest story by far came from Marcus. It was a tale about the haunting of Little Landry. But that's a story for another day. Let's get back to the Weeping Woods. After a couple hours of hanging about, drinking tea, and discussing what we'd do come dawn, the four of us agreed to sleep early. We were exhausted after the long drive north and the trek through the woods, and the sooner we slept, the more energy we'd have to venture out at dawn. So we snuffed out our campfire, the embers hissing as cool water consumed them, and we crawled into our tents. There was one for each of us. Once I'd gotten my belongings in order and felt comfortable in my bedding, I clicked my flashlight off. A little light leaked in from the others' tents as they shuffled around. Then they turned their lights off too. What remained was perfect, absolute darkness. I held my hand out right in front of my face and moved it side to side and couldn't see a thing. And apart from the odd cough or shuffle from one of my companions, the only noise that remained was the ethereal sighing of the wind. As creepy as it was, there was a certain coziness to being bundled up in a sleeping bag while surrounded by nature. Plus, as I mentioned, I was exhausted, so I managed to drift to sleep. The coming hours were marked by a fitful slumber. I had nightmares there in that forest, but I couldn't tell you what they were about. It's like I know, but don't know. All I can say is that I was racked by dark dreams for the few hours that I was asleep, and then I woke, to the sound of creaking wood. My breath caught in my throat when I heard it. Fear danced up my spine. I know, we were in the forest. Of course there was creaking wood. But no, this creaking was different. This creaking was long, slow, with whispers hidden within. This creaking was alive. Slowly I sat up within my tent, head swiveling one way, then the next in the dark, as I tried to ascertain which direction the noise came from. But I couldn't. It was as though the sound came from all directions. There was no longer any wind, only the creaking. I wondered whether my friends were awake too. If I was alone in hearing the sound, would they believe me if I told them about it come the morning? I considered calling out to them, but the truth was I was so damn scared in that moment that no words would have come. Images flashed in my mind as my imagination conjured a visage to match that horrible creaking. And then I heard it. I nearly missed it over the din of the forest. But I heard it. Jack's quivering voice, just barely louder than a whisper. "He's here. Stay in your tents. Don't look at him." The way he uttered the words sent ice through my veins. My limbs grew as stiff as the tree trunks surrounding our camp as I held my breath and closed my eyes. The creaking came closer. I heard shuffling from one of the other tents. It made me angry. Who the hell was making so much noise? The whispering within the creaking grew louder. I could almost make out words within the hissing gibberish. And then a blinding light came on, so bright against the forest's dark that I noticed it through my eyelids. Instinctively, I opened my eyes and looked up. Through my tent's mesh fabric, I saw a figure standing with a flashlight in hand. By the shape and height and trembling of the figure, I knew it was Jack. Concern for my friend turned out to be a stronger force than that of fear. "Jack," I gasped. "What are you doing?" He raised a hand in the direction of my tent. "Quiet. Close your eyes and be quiet. I'm fine." The tone of his voice told me that I had to obey. I closed my eyes again and held my breath. The creaking drew even nearer. It sounded like it was just outside my tent, wood, straining and flexing under a sort of weight. Jack's breathing had grown ragged. There were hints of whimpering accompanying each panting breath. I wasn't religious, but at that moment, I nearly started praying to whatever God might listen. I would have done so, in fact, if the creaking didn't stop, but it did. All at once, a sighing breeze washed over our campsite, and the oppressive, creaking presence that had stood among us was gone. And as I opened my eyes and saw a flashlight laying on the forest floor, I realized that Jack was gone too. I crawled toward my tent flap and unzipped it. "Jack?" I called. As I ambled out, I saw Tina doing the same, her eyes wide in the dark. "He's gone," she whispered. A second later, Marcus's flap opened, and he poked his head out. His expression told me that he, too, had been awake for all of it. "Jack," I cried, far more loudly than I was comfortable with. There was no reply. I picked up his flashlight, swinging it around in every direction, squinting into the gloom beyond the trees. There was nothing, no one. I pointed the flashlight at the ground where it had laid. An impression in the mulch clearly marked the flashlight, as well as the spot where Jack had stood, but there were no obvious marks leading away from there. Tina startled me as she barked a laugh. "Oh, this is great. This is absolutely fantastic." Scowling at her, I said, "What are you talking about? This is a prank. Of course it's a prank. And Jack got us good." She shook her head, chuckling. I tried to think clearly despite my racing heart. After a moment, I nodded. "I suppose that's the most logical thing to assume." "Are you kidding me?" Marcus Whisper shouted. "You both heard the wood, didn't you?" "Yeah, but we're in a forest, aren't we?" I replied. "In a creepy forest, no less," Tina agreed. "I reckon Jack just pulled the prank of the century on us." She pointed at some of the recording equipment. "And he's got the whole damn thing recorded. We'll never live this down." "Right," I said. "I told Marcus, we'll look at the footage. That'll settle your nerves, won't it?" He nodded. "Let's." Tina gathered the one camera that was pointed at our camp. It was cold, so I struck up another fire in the pit as she looked through the footage. I glanced at my phone as I settled into my chair. It was 12:15 a.m., just past midnight. "Ha!" she burst out after another minute's searching. "Told you so." She leapt from her seat, rounding the fire before crouching between Marcus and I. As she hit play on the camera, we saw a grainy image of our tents, lit only by Jack's flashlight as he stood amidst them, looking around. I briefly thought I could make out a couple pale figures in the dark background, but quickly dismissed the notion given how unclear the image was. "Is there audio?" I asked. "Should be." "Yeah," answered Tina. "Then why is there no noise?" She shrugged. "We must have been imagining things." A few tense moments of the video passed before Jack froze. His flashlight pointed in the direction of nothing that we could see. Maybe it was something off camera? The 50mm lens captured the breadth of our camp, but not much beyond it. Or maybe he was just pranking us, after all. In any case, he set the flashlight down, even as he craned his neck to keep his eyes fixed on whatever he was looking at. Then he walked in that same direction, the light shining brightly off his back as he went. He wasn't moving quickly or slowly, just steadily. And that confirmed that there was audio on the recording, because we heard the crunching of leaves as Jack departed. "You see?" Tina said as she hit pause on the video. "Bastard pranked the hell out of us." She straightened, letting the camera rest on its strap, and cupped her hands around her mouth. "Jack, come out already. Prank's done. You win." If he was actually hiding somewhere in the dark, he didn't even make a peep. Tina called out a couple more times, and I even joined in on the last one, insisting that Jack come back. There was no answer. "You still think this is a prank?" Marcus asked. I looked at him, uncertain. Tina sternly said, "Yes." Marcus frowned. "Then where the hell is Jack?" Tina looked away. I stood up with a sigh. "Look, whatever this is, we've got to track him down one way or another, right? We're in the woods and far from any sort of help. Even if this is just a really overdone prank, we can't risk him getting lost or hurt out there." "Oh, fuck me," Marcus groaned as he pressed his face into his hands. "Yeah, that's fair," Tina agreed. "It's chilly. Let's bundle up a little, grab as many lights as we can carry, and head out. I'll also keep this camera running." "I'll grab a knife," Marcus said. Tina and I looked at him uncomfortably. "To mark the trees," he said as he rolled his eyes. "So we can actually find our way back?" "Ah," I replied. "Smart." A couple minutes later, we set out into the forest, in the direction that the flashlight had been pointing when Jack left it. We called out his name, our voices losing some of their optimism with each repetition. Our lights were less effective than they should have been. The darkness seemed to devour them, making it hard to see farther than 20 or so feet ahead. Fear and frustration mingled in my chest as I looked left and right, peering through the trees, shouting as loudly as my courage let me. Jack, 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 Jack. Marcus cursed. I've marked 15 trees, guys. We should really turn back. Sure, I sighed. We'll head back, then start out again in a different direction. As we turned around, a sharp crack sounded. Tina screamed. Gasping and looking over at her, I braced for what I might see. What, Tina? What is it? She was looking down, with one hand placed over her chest. Oh God. She stepped back. Come look. Marcus and I padded towards her. A broken old bone lay in Tina's boot print. It's human, she whispered. What? I spat, genuinely startled. How do you know? Because I studied this sort of thing in a recent course, she hissed. That is, without a doubt, a human femur. Grimacing, I brushed the mulch aside with my boot, revealing more of the skeleton. Marcus gasped. You don't think... I frowned at him. You mean? I glanced back down at the skeleton. Oh no, definitely not. These bones are old. There's no way. Maybe it's the guy who had parked his car at the edge of the woods, offered Tina. Maybe, I murmured as I uncovered more of the corpse. By the time I'd finished, the three of us were looking down on a full human skeleton. The hands' arms were folded over the ribcage, with most of the hand bones resting on the sternum at the center of the chest. Mixed in with those hand bones was a bundle of sticks. Jesus Christ, Tina muttered. She was still recording, making sure not to miss a thing. Let's hurry back, I said. A sense of dread was settling in. Maybe I was being impractical, but I couldn't help it. Marcus led the way, as he could best recognize the tree markings. Our pace was hurried, frantic even. Even Tina was spooked. The few times I looked at her, I saw her mouth pursed to a thin line. In hindsight, it's silly to think that it was the dead one that spooked us so much, the one we didn't even know. Marcus stepped back into camp and immediately gathered wood for a new fire. Tina paced back and forth, keeping to herself. I was antsy, restless, terrified. I feared the worst. We need to head out again. Jack is still out there. Marcus and Tina looked at me. Tina said, where would we even look? I don't know. Anywhere. Pick a direction. I aimed my flashlight opposite from the way Jack had left, shining its light through a row of trees, and gasped. I saw a pair of legs poking out from behind one of the trunks. By the style of pants, I knew... Geez, I'm sorry. As I mentioned at the start of this story, talking about this is difficult. Particularly once I get to this part. I realize this is abrupt, but I need to take a bit of time to gather my thoughts, to regroup. Give me a day, and I promise I'll get back to you with the rest of this story. In the meantime, I encourage you to avoid the woods if you can. You certainly won't find me within 50 miles of any forests. See you soon. If that gave you chills, just wait until you hear what happens next. Apartment for rent. Inquire within. I always liked having my own space. I'd had my fair share of experience with cramped dorms and messy, inconsiderate roommates. It wasn't for me. So when I found a small ground-floor apartment near campus, I didn't hesitate. It wasn't fancy, but it had everything I needed. Quiet, private, and fairly cheap, perfect for my last year of university. Everything was good. Until the neighbors started complaining. It began with Mrs. Reed from next door catching me in the hallway one morning. She looked tired, her eyes heavy with bags. Elizabeth, are you having late-night parties? She asked, her voice sharper than usual. I blinked, confused. No, I go to bed at 10. She shook her head, a deep frown settling into her jowls. I hear music, laughing, banging on the walls. You should be more considerate. I hadn't heard a thing. I'm sorry, but it's not me, I promise. She squinted at me like she didn't believe a word I said. Just keep it down. Nights were quiet on my end. I didn't throw parties or invite friends over. I'm a bit of a recluse, honestly. I barely left the apartment aside from classes or library runs. Still, the complaints didn't stop. More neighbors started approaching me in the hallways, their faces drawn and annoyed, asking about the noise. To keep it down. The thing is, though, every night I slept like a rock. Nothing woke me up. Nothing ever stirred. I tried staying up one night to catch the sound, but I was too exhausted. I wasn't going to sacrifice my sleep for something I knew I wasn't contributing to, so I passed out around 11 p.m. with no disturbances. One evening, after a long day of studying at the library, I came home to find a note slipped under the door. It was crumpled and hastily written. Noise complaints. Handle it. Next to it, bizarrely enough, was a chocolate bar wrapper. A small amount of slick, melted chocolate still inside. The letter itself smeared in it. I was pissed about. What the hell? It wasn't even me making the noise. And why? Why stuff your own trash along with the letter? Frustrated and tired, I tossed the note on the counter and the wrapper in the trash. Then, I collapsed into bed and fell into a study-induced coma. That was the night things started going missing. At first it was small stuff. Pens, keys, a sock here or there. The usual, nothing suspicious. They always turned up, but never where I left them. I figured it was stress. Finals were around the corner, and I was so drowsy all the time. I chalked it up to forgetfulness. Then one morning, I found my toothbrush sitting on the coffee table. It was damp, tinged brown. The odd thing? I hadn't brushed my teeth yet. I knew I hadn't. I still had morning breath. I started to wonder if I was sleepwalking. Could I have been getting up in the middle of the night, moving things without realizing it? Making loud noises? I considered having a friend stay over to keep an eye on me, but that felt extreme. I finally got my answer a week later, at a point where I was being threatened with eviction due to these unexplained noise complaints. I noticed a panel in the base of my closet was ajar. I froze. The base always looked solid before, nothing loose. Curiosity got the better of me, sliding it open some more and being met with a stale, cool breeze rising up from below. Stupid, I know, but I peeked my head in, discovering a crawl space. It couldn't be more than 3 feet high, dank and covered in thick, dusty cobwebs. Scattered throughout the space were chocolate bar wrappers. It smelt like mold and sickly sweetness. I guess I was naive. I assumed I'd find some wily raccoons, a stray cat. I turned on my phone's flashlight and peered further in. There were several cushions steeped in mold, discarded soda cans, more chocolate bar wrappers. It smelt of sugar and rank air. No scratching, no animal sounds. But deeper into the darkness, I saw them. 4 pairs of eyes, squinting from the light I brought in with me. As my eyes settled, I realized what was staring back at me. 2 children sat cross-legged on the floor. They were pale, gaunt, with dark circles under their eyes. But their knees rocked with giddy excitement, their smiles smeared with chocolate. The boy let out a small giggle as his eyes met mine. Slumped against the left side was a woman. Her face was blank, her eyes unfocused, staring at everything and nothing in particular. And in the far corner, drenched in darkness, was a man, hunched on all fours, watching me intently with a calm expression. "You're finally here." His voice was soft, with a hint of malice. He gestured toward the children, who were still giggling. "The kids love playing at night. Apologies, they can get a little loud." He smirked, a small, controlled smile. From his pocket, he revealed a tiny glass bottle. "I've been helping you, though. You're a sound sleeper when you're properly dosed." My blood ran cold as the cramped, rank space I peeked my head into began to spin. "You've been drugging me?" He shrugged, nonchalant, then gestured toward the woman slumped in the corner. "My wife doesn't talk much these days, but she enjoys the company." The woman didn't react to being addressed. Something cold brushed against my hand. The little girl was crouched next to me, her fingers icy as she tugged at my fingers. Her eyes were wide as she stared up at me, her smile never fading. "Want to play?" I scrambled backwards out of the crawlspace before slumping back in a daze. My limbs felt like lead, my vision blurry. I heard the children let out disappointed cries as the man's face peeked out of the crawlspace, half hidden in shadow. "Don't worry," he whispered, his voice dripping with menace. "You'll love it here. We all do. Don't we, kids?" High-pitched cheers echoed out. That's the last thing I remember. The sound of happy children and the man's toothy grin rearing up from underneath. And do you know what? He wasn't wrong. A difficult transition, as all things are. Didn't sleep the first week, and now I sleep all day. Probably sugar crashing to Baja. Now I love it here. I've grown fond of the kids and their games. I've come to learn that the wife is called Margaret, and she isn't officially his wife. Sometimes her eyes follow me, and she'll mumble something incoherent, like she has something to tell me, but it comes out twisted. Generally, she's quiet, but I enjoy her company. Mrs. Reed doesn't complain anymore. In fact, I haven't seen her in days. I'm sure she'll understand eventually, just like I did. Anyway, the apartment's finally prepped for a new tenant. 550 p.m., a really great bargain in this area, especially with such quiet neighbors. Inquire below. We can't wait to meet you. You think that was scary? The next story will leave you looking over your shoulder. Being dead has its perks. It was early August in Marin, and the town was still half asleep, but I was awake, and as usual, I was thinking about the dead. I lay belly up in front of a rusting fan doing its decrepit best to fight off the heat. The fan turned painfully slowly, a rickety side to side, like a geriatric old woman crossing the road, one agonizing shuffling step at a time. The creak of the blades rotating cut through all the dead faces crawling around in my head. I thought about throwing it out of the window, ending its suffering, but it was too hot to sacrifice even the tiny breeze it was giving me. I had my legs kicked above my head, resting on the wall that was covered from top to bottom in time-stained Polaroids, like a wallpaper print of all the people I loved the most. I slept each night with them watching over me. My celluloid guardian angels, forever watching so I wouldn't forget their faces. Sweat pooled in my collarbones, and even though the blinds were closed, the sun was relentless as it fought its way through the gaps. Chrissy came in, footsteps loud and so familiar I didn't need to look to see if it was her, because I knew her from the soles up. From soul to soul was the way it felt. She threw herself down onto my bed like she had so many times before, shape familiar as my own on the blankets. Her bright pink hair fanned out from her temples like a sunset in late June, a soft and beautiful chemical smear carrying the whole summer sky on her head. "Fuck me up the ass and call me Jesus, but it's hot," she said, throwing her legs up to join mine. Her dusty combat boots hovered against the Polaroid wall. Her right boot came to rest in front of a photo of us on the first day of high school. Eyes bright, middle fingers in matching chipped purple polish flipped up at the camera, arms slung around each other. Her left boot fell against a Polaroid of me doing a handstand she'd taken at the beach, the year her brother Travis got his license. We spent all spring just driving out of town as fast as Travis's truck would go, Chrissy screaming at him to go faster, shaking his headrest, all of us pretending we'd never heard of shitty little place called Marin as the streets disappeared behind the tires in a cloud of dust. "Well then, Jesus, did you bring any lube?" I said. Chrissy grinned and stuck out her tongue as a reply, too lazy in the heat to think of a comeback. We lolled our heads and let them hang off the mattress. The room was now upside down, but Chrissy was still the right way up. That was how things often seemed these days. "It's gonna happen again, Sadie," she said, with her eyes closed. The heat pressed in, and outside I could hear a sprinkler starting up. Summer lazed on through the morning, but I was now wide awake, and the dead were loud in my head. Again. Okay, I sat up. That was all there was to say. No point in questioning the inevitable. When and where? Don't know that yet. Don't even know his name yet. He's getting hungry. Her forehead creased. He's been dreaming about her. She shook her head. Dreaming real bad dreams. Just tell me what to do. Where to be. We'll stop him. I said. I looked down at her, still the only right thing up in the room. We always do. I lay back down. "I know," she said, our legs side by side above our heads almost touching, like we were joined at the hip, grown from the same bones. "But I think you'll have to kill him." I side-eyed her, taking her in as she swore at the fan, panting like a dog in the summer heat. I looked at the constellation of freckles across the bridge of her nose, and the small silver bar through her right eyebrow that flashed like a star when it caught the light. Her eyeshadow was dark, smudged like she'd slept in it. And though right now her eyes were closed, I knew them so well that I knew when they opened, they would be deep green like the trees in spring, right before they burst with flower blooms. I looked at the gaping hole where her jawbone should be on the left side of her face. I could see the rips through the layers of sinew and skin to her cracked teeth, a jagged half-moon slicing across her cheek, putting her face in eclipse. The soft curve of her eye socket hung just below her forest green eye. There was loose cartilage hanging round the crush of her brow bone, poking through sharp and white. I looked at the blood that floats gently in small looping tendrils just above the surface of where her skull is caved in. Chrissy is my best friend, and I never get tired of looking at her face. I guess I should also mention that Chrissy is dead. To be specific, Chrissy is dead because when we were 16 years old, a man hunted her down through the woods, bashed her head in with a rock, and left her to die after he was done with her body. Chrissy has been dead for 5 years, 11 months, and 22 days, if we're being really specific. I started seeing her 2 weeks after she died. At first, I thought the psych ward was calling my name, grief finally pulling me all the way under. But I'm not crazy, I swear. I'm not lying either. The things I've done are very, very real. Chrissy may be dead, but I can't imagine life without her. But let me go back a little, to before that sweltering morning in my room in August. Before I had to hunt down and kill a hungry man I would later find out was named Amos Everett. Before all the bad, I want to talk about all the good. All the love. There's always love, and I forget about it sometimes, but it was there, and it's still here. I carry it. When we met, I was 5, and Chrissy was 5. I had blue eyes like a Crayola sky, and she had green like apples and grass and 4-leaf lucky clovers. We loved playing tag in the woods, and daisy chains and ghost stories and glitter. We loved the horses that lived in the field behind the trailer park, would spend hours chasing after them behind the chain-link fences, wishing we could keep up, kicking up clouds of dust and grass with our battered sneakers. We loved stealing gummy worms from the gas station and hiding out in the magnolia trees to share our stolen goods, sun-melted sugar on our hands, the only evidence left behind. When I fell down, Chrissy would be there to swipe one curious finger through the bloody scrape on my knee before carefully pressing a pink Band-Aid on top, pulling me back up with both hands, wiping my eyes and spinning us in circles over and over until I stopped crying and started laughing instead. When I was 7, Chrissy was 7. We got the training wheels on our bikes off on the same day, out in the yard practicing with her older siblings and her cousins, getting rides to school with them while my mom was in an hour of the hospital. Chrissy's bike was hand-me-down blue with flames painted up the sides by her dad, and she rode so fast it was like she was burning up the sidewalks when she pedaled past in a blur of sugar and blonde hair. My bike was the color of dirt, with butterfly stickers covering up the rust on the handlebars, slapped on with careful application by Chrissy after the other kids laughed at me for my run-down ride. When Chrissy was 8, I was 8. She could run faster than any of the boys in our grade, and I was never far behind, always following on her heels, kicking up dust like a shadow. Sometimes she'd slow her pace a little, so we could run side by side in the sun in our white tube socks, matching our strides like we were twins made of muscle and bone. But sometimes there was something in her that just needed to run, and I grew used to the sight of her back as she left me behind, left everything behind. Like if she just ran fast enough, she would grow wings from her shoulder blades and fly away. She would braid my hair for me on the playground just like her sister Luana taught her, so we could match, her with blue ribbons and mine with red. We'd listen to anything on her older sister's busted CD player as long as it was loud. Britney Spears and Sum 41, Tupac and the Backstreet Boys, Avril Lavigne and Willie Nelson, eating peach rings while her mama painted our nails, sat on the carpet with us, cross-legged, playing we were grown up at the salon. I still slept with a nightlight at home, but whenever I stayed over at Chrissy's when my mom was getting really bad, the dark in her room didn't bother me so bad. When Chrissy was 10, I was 10. I was taller now, and she was mad about it. Chrissy loved Beanie Babies and firing her Travis's BB gun at bud cans on their back porch while I watched and screamed and cheered her on like a little animal. I loved shiny purple eyeshadow and pretending we were mermaids at the community pool in the summer and learning dance routines off MTV, which we would practice for hours in my room. We would stay up all night watching the scariest horror movies her daddy had on VHS and scream our lungs out at every jump scare and then laugh so hard at each other for being scared we almost pissed our pants. But I was never really scared when I was with her. On Chrissy's 10th birthday, we stole 2 of her mama's Newports and smoked them in secret like we were lighting birthday candles, giggling and choking on the spearmint smoke. Side by side, crouched in the long grass with our knees touching. We felt like we were fully grown in our denim cutoffs underneath that yawning sky, studded with stars like spilled glitter. When I was 13, Chrissy was 13. We had waist-length hair we would brush for each other, yanking through tangles until we shone. We made matching friendship bracelets with our names spelled out in beads, so all the other girls in school would know that we were yin and yang. Where one went, the other would never be far behind. Twin flames. We always got joint invites, whether it was trailer park slumber parties on mattresses outside or rich kids' pool parties in the big white houses at the edge of Marin. Because if I wasn't invited, Chrissy would go feral. Whoever's invite it was would end up begging me to come, admittedly sometimes crying. Chrissy had that effect, but nobody seemed to care. Everyone wanted to be her friend, like petting a stray dog before it bites, because it looks so beautiful despite its jaws. We loved sharing vanilla lip gloss and dollar store perfume and reading teen magazines. We loved rhinestones and butterflies and boy bands and playing with hunting knives in the woods. When a kid called Billy Jensen and his slimy friends pinned me round the back of the gym and Billy stuck his hand up my skirt, Chrissy punched him so hard she knocked his front tooth out and kept it in a matchbox like a little hunting trophy. I still have it on a shelf in my room. When I was 15, Chrissy was 15. I moved in with my Aunt Jane, and I had a backyard now too, and red curtains on my window she made for me herself, and Marin had never seemed smaller. Me and Chrissy would scheme all weekend, pinning maps to my bedroom walls, all the places we would be. We were going to burn high school to the ground. We were cheerleaders, and we swore we would be smarter and cooler and bigger and stronger than everyone else. We would get our diplomas and leave everyone and everything in the rearview mirror as soon as we got our licenses, send postcards from coast to coast. This town was small, and we were as big as the whole goddamn sky. We were going to chew it up and spit it back out, move to Hollywood or Alaska or Nashville or Paris or Hawaii or Tokyo or the fucking moon, and never ever look back. We were at that age when boys were still chasing us, and it wasn't just playground tag anymore. It was something more animal. But Chrissy had taught me how to run fast years ago, and we'd leave them in the dirt and laugh with all our teeth bared like fangs. We still loved glitter and ghost stories. We still loved riding our bikes down to the 7-Eleven for slushies, mine red and hers blue so we could mix them and make purple, watching them melt on our tongues in the heat of summer. Chrissy tattooed a shooting star on her wrist with a needle, and her mama cried and said she was going straight to hell, before she burst out laughing, realizing how ridiculous that was, and Chrissy just laughed along with her, because she knew there are far worse things to do than put the night sky on your arm. Travis's dog Buster knocked up the neighbor's Bichon Frise and dropped a litter of puppies right before Halloween, and we loved running around the backyard with them once their eyes opened and they found their feet, chasing leaves and birds as the air turned cold. I helped Chrissy dye her hair bright pink in the bathroom sink one evening, just after Valentine's Day. Snow falling outside, music turned up loud enough to block out the sounds of her parents fighting with Luana for getting herself knocked up, just like the neighbor's dog, by one of the boys from the auto shop. We loved sharing bottles of Malibu and whiskey we'd steal off my mom. And we loved setting off bottle rockets in the backyard and screaming and spinning in circles underneath the trails of sparks like they were shooting stars. Spinning and spinning and spinning until we fell down laughing. When I was 16, Chrissy was 16. And when I was 17, Chrissy was still 16. Because one night in August, Chrissy was riding her bike home, and a man was waiting for her on the side of a dusty back road that should have led home, and not to her death. He dragged her off her bike as the sun went down above the trees and the sky burned orange, and he chased her through the woods with a hunting knife, the kind you use for the soft belly of a deer. Only this time the chase wasn't pretend. It wasn't running from boys on the playground anymore. It wasn't human, it was animal, primal. And Chrissy had spent her whole life running. And she was fast, and she was strong, and she was brave. She ran so fast through those woods like she was chasing horses, kicking up dust, like she could grow wings from her shoulder blades and just fly away. She almost made it. She almost fucking made it. But she didn't. When I was 18, Chrissy was still 16. Because she died alone and scared, in the dark in the woods, and I wasn't there. And he smashed her head in with a rock and did things to her body while she was choking on her own blood that I can't even think about, and I wasn't there. And when I was 22, Chrissy was still 16 because she died and I didn't, and I miss her every single day when I wake up. And some nights when I can't sleep, I wish it had been me. I miss her in the summer, and I miss her in the winter, and I will never stop missing her, even when she's right here next to me. She wasn't like my sister. She was like my conjoined twin. We were fused. She was my family, my blood pact, my pinky promise, spit and swear it forever, one half of our secret handshake, the leader of our pack of two. Wherever she was where I would be. And then she was gone. I used to think that when she died, all the love went with her, but it's still here. You need to know about the love, I think, to understand the rest. It took them 4 days to find her body. They say God took 7 days to make the world, but it only took 4 days for our own to collapse. Every day, Chrissy's mom and all her uncles and aunts and cousins drove their trucks around Marin, handing out photos, kicking down doors, calling in favors, searching for her in strangers' beds and basements, screaming at our small-town cops to do better, look closer, crawl on their knees for traces of her. Every day, Luana sat in the police station with my Aunt Jane, waiting for news, belly heavy in her hands, phoning hospitals all the way to state lines for any girl with pink hair, green eyes, stars on her skin. Every day, Travis and their daddy went out with all their hunter friends, trucker caps covering worried eyes, old ladies from church in their hiking boots, kids from school with shovels, dragging the woods and the lakes and rivers, searching for that pink hair half buried in the dirt or floating in a creek like reeds. But I spent that entire week sat on Chrissy's front porch, just waiting for her. Someone needed to be there when she got back. I would be there when she came back, and then we could laugh about it. I wanted to laugh about it with her. I slept out there with Buster the dog every night, just waiting, because I knew she was going to come home. Buster would howl, long and lonesome, like the world was ending because Chrissy wasn't here, and I knew exactly how he felt. He sounded just like my heart. Sometimes Travis would join me, and we'd sit shoulder to shoulder in silence, waiting until he got restless and found his way back to the woods. Once, Chrissy's mom tried to make me go home, called my Aunt Jane to come get me, then changed her mind. In the end, she just sat out there with me, passed me one of her Newports, her eyes glazed over, hands shaky, clutching her rosary and a bottle of beer. I knew she wished more than anything I was mine. Chrissy sat beside her, my body buried in the woods or rotting in the trunk of a car instead, and I wished it too. Blew the cigarette out like a birthday candle and wished and wished and wished. I dreamt about Chrissy, running through the woods, and I would wake up in a sweat so heavy it was as if I'd been river baptized. Terrified of the dark without her. Without her, there was no light left. She'd been the sun, and now everything was shadows. And then on the 4th day I woke up, and she was there, watching me sweat, standing over me with her beautiful face half smashed in, blood in her pink hair, smile on her face. She knelt down and she laughed at me for still being scared of the dark, like a little kid. I fell back asleep. And when I woke up for the second time, Chrissy's mom was standing over me with those same evergreen eyes, face so similar for a moment I thought it was Chrissy again. She very gently told me that they'd found her and that I should go back to sleep before she walked into the house. I heard her screaming from the kitchen, and she didn't stop for a long time. Travis and their dad had been the ones to find her, slowly rotting with maggots in her belly, blood fading to a dark maroon. All her daddy wanted to do was carry her out of the woods in his arms, small like a child still sleeping, the way he'd carried her out of the hospital when she was born. But he saw her and he could only think, crime scene. His little girl's body, now a crime scene. His little girl, now just a body. Travis told me later, His dad had howled and beat his hands bloody on one of the trees waiting for the cops, fighting the urge to go to her, clawing at the dirt, staggering, pleading for them to hurry up. Terrified, every second gone was more time wasted, more evidence fading. Travis just sat on his knees in the dirt like he was praying. Doesn't remember how he got to the ground. Kept waiting for her to get up, yelling at her to just get up, mad she was making their dad so upset. Travis called an ambulance, begging for them to hurry. They could still save her. Watching the maggots crawl in her belly, the blood crack around her mouth. They could still save her. She just needed to get up, and she'd be okay. They could still save her. And when the cops came, leading his dad away, trying to bandage his hands, hanging out yellow tape, they pulled Travis up, dragging him away when he wouldn't move. Couldn't move. And he just kept thinking that he wasn't the one that needed to get up. She was. She would. She had to. They could still save her. He could still save her. Travis told me later when his mom showed up that she just kept grabbing cops while they tried to placate her, saying over and over, "That ain't my girl. You've made a mistake. That's someone else's daughter. Somebody should call her poor mother so she's not alone. She'll be getting worried, you see." I know how worried she must be. Bless her heart. It'll be dark soon, and she'll start to worry about her daughter. You should call her. I can do it for you if it's easier. Mother to mother, you know how it is. It's okay, I forgive you. Everybody makes mistakes. But that's not Christine, you see. So we need to find her. That's not Chrissy. We need to find my baby. You need to keep looking. Please just keep looking. That ain't my girl. That ain't my girl. Kept saying it until there was nobody left to listen. My best friend is dead, and there's ain't a damn thing either of us can do about it. But being dead has its perks. Chrissy says it's hard to describe, as the dead don't sleep and the dead can't dream. But sometimes a little like when your eyes unfocus. A little like when you wake up still half asleep, and for a moment you can't be sure if you're awake or dreaming. Chrissy slips into a place she calls the in-between. It's like dreaming, only it's the truth. Things that could, or will, or might happen. Endless possibilities stretching out that the dead can see and feel, because the possibilities that float through the in-between end in death. Death leaves a trail wherever it goes. It stains the fabric of the world, Chrissy says. It causes ripples in the universe, leaves things dark. To be specific, Chrissy can see when someone is going to be killed. To be really specific, Chrissy can see when girls around her age or abouts are going to be abducted, or violated, or brutally murdered, just like she was. I don't know why, she can't explain it. She says it would be like trying to explain breathing if you'd never had lungs. She says it's like muscle memory, for muscles and memories I don't have. She says since she died, it's like she was born knowing these things. They've always been in her heart, and in her head, it's just now she's dead that she can see them clearly, like the fog has lifted. She says it's like a feeling in her now non-existent ghostly gut, but sometimes she slips through to the in-between and comes out with these visions. They start hazy, but the closer and closer the days get to the murder, the clearer the visions become, like a camera focusing. The fog lifts, and she can see the name and the face of the victim and the killer, until she can feel their thoughts, taste their feelings, their possibilities. This is where I come in. The dead can't dream, and the dead can't sleep, but the dead also can't touch. I would give anything to hold her one more time, but she just passes right through me, which is not a pleasant feeling, believe me. But the living can touch, and the living can also hold a gun, or a crowbar, or a shovel, which I do. The living can bury bodies and bleach blood off the tile grout, and burn evidence in a trash can in the backyard, which I also do. Don't get me wrong, I don't often kill these men. I can still count on my hands the amount of people I've killed, although I'm starting to run out of fingers. Sometimes I can put a payphone and some pocket change to use, can anonymously tip off police and get them arrested before they can do any damage. Sometimes I can stall my car in traffic and make them just 5 minutes late, and it changes everything. Sometimes I just have to drop a threatening letter in red Sharpie saying "I'm watching you, motherfucker" through their front door, and they become so paranoid they don't act on anything. Sometimes I can get to the girl first, convince her to be somewhere else that night, Or just stop and talk about the weather for long enough that they walk down the street at a totally different time than they would have. And the man that was going to kill them with a claw hammer walks right by without noticing them. 5 minutes can change the entire goddamn universe in ways you wouldn't believe. Last month, I spent 5 minutes with a girl named Lorelei Lucas. I was wearing white jeans, and I'd carefully smeared a little blood across the back of them, and walked past her in line at the grocery store. Chrissy had seen Lorelei Lucas and her bouncy dark hair and her chipped front tooth and her secret dreams of becoming an architect floating out there in the in-between. She'd seen her kindness, the overflowing love she had for her little sister, her deep belief that what you put out, you get back. So I walked past her, where she stood in line holding a paper bag of red apples and a box of pink wine. Lorelei's hand had flown to her mouth, smudging her peachy lip gloss a little, and she'd reached out and grabbed my elbow. "Oh, honey, stop a sec," she'd said. I'd looked at her, miming my confusion, wide-eyed. "I think your Aunt Flo has come for a visit a little early," she'd whispered loudly and kindly in her Bayou drawl, gesturing down at my jeans. I turned round and looked, gasped, feigning mortification, and she just smiled and slipped off her red cardigan and tied it round my waist without hesitation. Lorelei was only a year older than I was, yet as she tied the sleeves, her hands steady and sure, I suddenly felt so small, like she was my mother taking care of me. The world slowed for a minute as I watched her French-tip nails, the little gold heart on the ring looped round her pinky finger. It's hard to remember sometimes with all that I do, that people can still be kind, for no other reason than that's who they are. I'd protested, and she'd just shaken her head and smiled. "Nah, you keep it, honey," she'd said. Again, I felt like she was my mother smoothing my hair back, setting the tipped-up world back to rights. "You just pay it forward somehow." When I thanked her, I wasn't pretending. I meant it. If only she knew how I was paying it forward. Chrissy had seen flashes of that same red cardigan in an evidence locker. Nearly black, it was so blood-stained and tattered from where Lorelei Lucas had been stabbed repeatedly through the stomach with a rusty copper pipe and ripped open, left in pieces on the floor of an abandoned dairy barn. But because she stopped me in the grocery store, because she was kind, because she couldn't stand to ignore someone that needed help, she didn't walk home down the road that would have taken her past a dusty black van. She didn't stop for the man leaning out of the back, pleading with her to help his little daughter inside. She didn't stoop through the van door, and she wasn't met with a solvent-soaked rag across the face. Her hands and ankles weren't duct-taped together. Her underwear wasn't cut from between her legs with kitchen scissors. And she wasn't driven out to a dilapidated barn that would be the last place she ever drew breath, that little gold ring on her finger turning red in her guts as she fought to hold her stomach together, intestines unspooling around her. Instead, she saw a girl that needed help, gave me the cardigan off her back, and it reminded her so much of middle school and her sister that she called her up. And they hadn't spoken much lately, life getting in the way. But they laughed so hard on the phone about growing up, they decided that they missed each other's faces and decided to meet up and reminisce some more over spiked iced teas and green salsa. So Lorelei Lucas walked the other way home to her sister's house and spent the night drinking pink wine and laughing and playing all the songs they'd loved as kids, as loud as the speakers would go, dancing round the kitchen until the neighbors banged on the walls to turn it down. And the man in the dusty black van sat on that street waiting until a cop car cruised past and spooked him so bad that he sped on the way home, wasn't watching the road, and ended up driving that dusty black van straight into a quarry ditch. And it wasn't a bad crash. He would have been a little banged up, but fine, if it wasn't for the bottle of chemical solvent that spilled, that soaked rag catching on the sparks and smoke from the crushed engine and setting the van alight in seconds. He never did manage to open the door, stuck against the quarry rocks on the other side, fighting beneath the airbag and twisted seatbelt, the very things meant to keep him safe, used against him. He was dead in 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes, and nothing but charred flesh and blacked bones, with nobody to bear witness but a ghost of a pink-haired girl who stayed and watched, to make sure he burned all the way down to nothing. Funny how it works, ain't it? What you put out, you get back. What you get, you pay forward. The thing is, sometimes 5 minutes isn't enough. Some of these men are like bottomless black pits straight into hell, infinite and unrelenting and evil. They won't stop for anything. They're like darkness as the sun goes down. You can try and outrun it, but the night still comes. You can't tip off the police because they hide it too well. They're too charming, or too careful, or too practiced. You can't convince their victim to be somewhere else that night, or make her late, or make sure he never walks past her, because he will simply just choose another girl. He will always choose another girl. It doesn't matter if you change things by 5 minutes or 5,000 minutes, they will never, ever stop. Their possibilities ripple through the universe, like black rot spreading, like poison in the water. As long as they're alive, the poison spreads, and there's no cure. Sometimes they need to die. Sometimes I have to suck out the poison, even if it means tasting some myself. And I do it. Whenever I'm washing out blood from the cracks in my nails that belonged to a man who had a penchant for schoolgirls, or stitching up a split lip and a hole in my shoulder from a fight I almost lost with a chainsaw-wielding psycho, long story, or straining the muscles in my shoulders from digging a hole big enough to drop a body into, I think about the girls. The life they get to live, never knowing it was almost taken from them. They get to grow up. They get to fall in love with the boy or girl next door and get married in a white dress and have babies they'll name after their favorite flowers. They get to be heartbroken and divorced, smash wine glasses against their bedroom walls, and total their ex-husbands' cars. They get to be high school dropouts with a DUI and a suitcase full of broken dreams. But they still get to dream. They get to be doctors and lawyers and firefighters, strippers and preschool teachers, ballerinas and bartenders, artists and addicts, cocktail waitresses and congresswomen. They get to drink too much and try too hard or not at all and fuck everything up over and over. And they get to try again and again every single day. All the beautiful, terrible, wonderful, fucked up mistakes that make up a life. They get it all. They get Christmases and Hanukkahs and New Year's and Diwalis. They get car crashes and college graduations and coffee in the morning made by someone that loves them. They get black eyes and breakups and best friends that drive all night just to see them and pick up the pieces. They get to sing off-key with the windows down as they drive home from jobs they hate, and come home to people that bought them pastries from their favorite bakery just because they knew they were having a shitty day. They get to call their mom on her birthday, and they get to hug their little brothers goodnight, and they get to fight with their older sisters over the remote, and they get to cook dinner with their dad on his day off. They get to swim in the ocean and catch snowflakes on their tongues. They get fireworks and birthday cakes and weddings and funerals. They get to feel the rain on their face and sun on their skin and watch the seasons change. They get wrinkled and gray and old, and they get to live long enough to forget what it's like to be 16. And every single second is a gift they don't even know they've received. They get to die old and content and surrounded by loved ones, or old and mean and alone. But it doesn't matter either way, because they get to die when they're meant to, on their terms, on their time, not because of a man who decided to rip them out of the life they should have lived. We never really get to see the girls again, once we save them. It's almost the hardest part sometimes, saving the life of someone who will never even know you exist. They walk past me like a stranger, and they never look back. They don't know I've killed for them, and I don't get to know what they will do with the life I've given back to them. And they never even see Chrissy at all. But sometimes, Chrissy gets little flashes that fall through the in-between, like shooting stars, bright and burning and exploding with light. Flashes of lives that shake the universe a little. One girl, who would have been kept in a basement tied to a pole until she starved to death, grew up and became a surgeon. She had a bad temper and was never around enough to save her marriage, but she saved so many thousands of lives that she made ripples in the universe, glowing and soaking up the spreading poison like an antidote. One girl who would have been cut into little pieces and scattered along the highways in black refuse sacks grew up and became a single mom and stripper. She had a mean right hook and a fucking foul mouth, and she was unrelentingly kind and generous and loving, a violent and unstoppable force of pure blinding goodness and love that touched the lives of everyone around her. So bright that it sent ripples through the universe like waves of sunlight on a beach, washing away a little of the darkness in everyone she met. The point isn't if these girls grow up to be good or bad or both. The point isn't whether one life is worth saving more than another. The point is that they are alive. The point is they get to grow up and make the choice to be good or bad or both for themselves. Chrissy never got that choice. I did. And this is what I've chosen. And I'd choose it over and over and over. And so that August morning, laying side by side on my bed, discussing the murder of a man whose name I didn't know yet with my dead best friend, I was thinking about choices. That was just the beginning. The next story is even more unsettling. I hate when someone takes my spot, the undergrowth and soil crunched with each step, as I took a deep breath and soaked in the natural beauty around me. It was a moderate 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Birds were singing, and the sun was shining down as I walked along the Strawberry Creek Trail. In about a half mile, I'd go off the trail to the designated backwoods camping area. The bubbling of the stream and the whisper of wind in the branches all sounded like an old friend welcoming me home. I had always considered Great Basin to be a hidden gem. It's the least visited national park in the States. In a few hours of hiking, I had only encountered 2 other people and 1 dog. And when I started into the wilderness to camp, I knew for sure I would be alone for the whole week. Working as a high school teacher, I got my fill of people every damn week. Don't get me wrong, I love my kids, but sometimes between them, my coworkers, supervisors, and angry parents, I could just feel like receding into a shell of jaded mistrust. Coming out here and enjoying the silence and peace of nature always made me feel better. I saw the familiar bend in the trail and started my way off the side and towards Blue Ridge. It was always my favorite spot to set up camp. A beautiful, peaceful meadow right under the shadow of Wheeler Peak. It was a strenuous hike, taking at least 2 days of non-stop marching from the parking area at the trailhead. But it was perfect, and it was always there for me. No matter what had happened in the 358 days leading up to this, I knew this week would be perfect. As I crested the ridge, I looked down at the field of small, flowering bushes. It was exactly as I remembered, always even more beautiful as the setting sun painted it in beautiful red hues. That's when I saw a tent, parked exactly where I planned on setting up. It looked like a small, one-person tent. Green canvas with a cold fire pit in front. I felt frustrated, then sad, then frustrated at myself for these immature feelings. It's not like you own the park. You can always find a different spot. I knew that rationally I should not be upset by this, but emotionally it felt like I had been betrayed by a family member. I sighed and trudged my way down to the field, setting down my pack at a spot about 1,000 feet away. Who knows? Maybe this could be good for you. One person with a shared interest instead of the usual crowd at work. I started making camp, trying my best to stay optimistic as I set up my tent and began to arrange a campfire. The sun had set completely by the time the fire was merrily crackling away. I ate a quick meal, just some canned soup I had brought. I'd be going fishing in the morning, but I always packed enough food just in case. I glanced over at the other tent as I chewed slowly. It was almost invisible in the waning moonlight. I hadn't seen anyone enter or exit the tent for the whole 2 hours I'd been there. And the strangest part was there was no fire or even the glow of a lantern. It must be on some all-day hike. I tried to rationalize it, but something about the old weathered tapestry hung in a sloppy triangle shape made me uneasy. I was being ridiculous, I knew. It was probably just a leftover from being bitter about having a neighbor in the first place. It made me think about back when I got ripped from my position in the middle school since they had fired a high school English teacher. In a day, my workload and class size doubled. It was the same feeling of something familiar being changed suddenly. I chuckled at myself for being so emotionally brittle. I need to relax and stop overthinking everything. I turned my thoughts to the rest of my week's plans as I slipped into my sleeping bag, letting the gentle breeze lull me asleep. The moon was shining coldly when I woke up with a jolt. I tried to stay still, listening carefully as I heard another twig snap just a yard from my tent. I could make out a dark silhouette, the figure of a man, projected on the nylon of my shelter. He seemed to be pacing like he was looking for something he had misplaced in the night. My heart began to pound as he slowly, quietly approached. As stealthy as I could manage with my heart bursting from my chest, I reached towards my pack. Scared to death, but still planning for the worst. Inside, I knew my Colt 1911 sat fully loaded, just in case. Call me paranoid, but with the amount of mountain lions out here in the basin, I always came prepared. Hello. The voice came from the figure, which now stood in arm's reach of my tent flap. It sounded tentative, stuttering, almost nervous, like a child going to wake his mother when he had a stomachache. I held my breath, my trembling hand gripping the cold metal of my firearm. Are you okay? The voice came again, definitely masculine, but it sounded more confident now, paternal in the way it expressed almost genuine concern. I don't know what possessed me to respond. I think it was reflexive, some innate Midwestern politeness. I'm fine, just leave me alone, I croaked, a hoarse reply barely quieter than a shout. We sat there in silence for a few more seconds, then the figure slowly walked away. He stalked off in an almost dejected manner, his head downcast. I shuddered, the interaction surreal and terrifying. But as much as I would have loved to write it off as a dream, I knew I was awake, feeling the indent left on my palm from the vice grip on my pistol. When the sun rose a few hours later, I felt no relief. I knew, deep down in my gut, the mysterious visitor was from the tent nearby. I resolved then and there to go and introduce myself. I was still trying to rationalize what had happened as perfectly normal. Maybe he was just socially awkward, maybe he was sleepwalking. Either way, I felt dread tie a knot in my stomach even tighter with each step as I approached. The campsite was even more dilapidated than I initially thought. The tent was torn, with ragged holes in the side, and a small, black backpack lay haphazardly by the fire. Looking at the state of the charcoal, I'd estimate no one had used the fire for at least a few months. I hesitated a few feet from the lean-to. I could see a lumpy human shape in the sleeping bag inside through the torn patches on the side. Hello? I called out, my voice quaking with fear. I sat in silence. Nothing budged, and it felt like even the birdsong of the waking world faded away. It was just me, and the sleeping form in front of me. His breathing seemed slow, the relaxed inhaling and exhaling rhythmic. With sudden concern for the well-being of my fellow camper, I resolved to try once more. Hey, are you okay? The moment the words left my lips, the figure sat up straight. His eyes stared forward, dark hair falling loosely in front of them. He was shirtless, his frame skeletal and pale. He smiled a vacant smile and began to nod slowly. I suddenly felt the way a mouse must feel right before the trap sprung and snapped its neck. I backed away slowly, then turned and walked back to my tent briskly. I had made up my mind. I was moving camp, packing everything up, and heading another half-day south. It wasn't just fear. I also knew I wouldn't be able to relax and enjoy my vacation if I was watching over my shoulder the whole time. But things would need to be significantly worse than a slightly strange, emaciated night owl for me to give up the hard-earned trip. I didn't even bother looking back at the stranger's camp as I made my way down toward Stella Lake. I wanted to take a break and get a quick swim in the ice-cold, snow-fed water. I was stiff after spending the whole night crouched, fondling my 1911. I made it to the lake by noon, dropped my pack on the rocky shore, and set my clothes inside it. I brought swim trunks for this exact reason, and I gasped as I settled into the gently lapping frosty waves. I saw a party of hikers on the opposite shore and gave a friendly wave. It made me feel safer, knowing that it wasn't just me and the freak I'd seen earlier. I swam a few laps until I began to shiver uncontrollably. I waded back to the shore where I had left my belongings. I grabbed the towel I set out and dried off. It was just after 1 p.m., so if I left now, I could make it to Spring Creek, where I planned to stay the rest of the trip. I opened my backpack and immediately noticed the absence of the clothes I had just put in. I dug through the pack frantically, laying every article out in a line on the ground. Everything else was exactly as it should be. I was especially relieved to find my gun, but my dirty laundry was gone. In the few minutes I spent in the lake, someone grabbed my shirt, pants, and underwear and ran off into the forest without me noticing. And I bet I know exactly who did it. The stranger from earlier must have followed me. Whatever fucked up reason he came to my tent, stole my clothes, I didn't want to know. At this point, I changed my plans completely. I'd work my way back towards the trailhead I had parked at. I'd cut around the base of Buck Mountain through the woods. There was a community trail there. Not on any maps, but well worn. I knew that it meant spending one more night in the park since it was a steep hike, but it was the most direct route back. I threw on my extra change of clothes and started a double-time pace up the gentle rocky slope into the forest. The whole time I was frantically looking at all sides of the trail. Every rustle in a bush, the chirp of a bird, or the knock of a falling acorn made me nearly break my neck as I whipped around. The sun set once again as I was deep in the trees along the side of the mountain. The evening sun no longer seemed beautiful, the pink and orange light casting long, twisting shadows that made me even more jumpy. I made camp hastily. I'd take a quick nap and get moving at first light. It may seem strange considering the situation, but trying to navigate at night in the forest is a death sentence, and I didn't want to get lost, especially if he was following me. I sat, quivering on my bedroll, waiting for the sound of footsteps to throw me into a full-on panic. Eventually, despite my anxiety, I drifted into an uneasy slumber. As the sun rose and dappled light fell on my face, I slowly felt my consciousness return before I staggered upright. The tent, swaying gently against the wind, was in tatters. Hundreds of small, jagged holes covered the blue synthetic surface, and one, a much larger one, was torn away right at the foot of my makeshift bed. That had been where I left my pack and my boots. Both of these items were gone now without a trace. As I looked closer, I gasped as I saw that each of the holes perfectly matched the shape of a set of human teeth. I let out a choked, desperate cry as I abandoned my shelter and ran into the woods towards the trail. My feet were torn into by small rocks, thorns, and roots with each step. I barely noticed the pain as I sprinted, flight response taking over entirely. The park ranger I ran into must have thought I'd lost it, the way he looked at me with pitying eyes. I hopped his truck, and he was kind enough to take me back to where I'd parked. I told him everything that had happened, words tumbling out in a jumbled mess. As I got out, he called me back for a second. Based on everything that happened, can you give me your contact info so we can follow up if you want to press any charges? The ranger said, his eyes friendly. I agreed, but somehow I doubted he would follow up on the mad ravings of a shoeless hiker. I drove back to the town outside of the park in a daze. My wallet, fortunately, had been in my pocket the whole trip, and the bread and breakfast had some vacancy. I fell back on the bed in my new room and sobbed. It wasn't just the fear of being hunted, nor the disappointment of a ruined vacation, but a sense of relief that overwhelmed me. I spent the rest of the day sightseeing in White Pine County. It's a cute area with some historic buildings and rustic casinos. By the time I came back to my motel room, I'd almost forgotten about my horrifying experience. I went to sleep, but not before triple-checking that the door was locked and dead-bolted. I tried to get comfortable on the stiff mattress, but the same feeling of being watched kept me awake. I rolled onto my side and tried to screw my eyes shut and force myself to rest. Suddenly, after about 10 minutes in this position, something happened that made my heart stop. The bed depressed slightly as someone sat down on it, and I could hear something sliding across the sheets. A moist, clammy hand started to stroke my hair gently, the same way you'd gently pet a kitten. I could hear him breathing, a harsh, ragged sound. I bit my tongue and tried to play possum, as the thin, bony fingers began to pluck hairs one by one from my scalp. Tears streamed down my face from the pain as he began pulling at clumps of it, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. I almost wrenched my arm away when I felt his other hand reaching down and grabbing my own. The hand held mine gently. It seemed almost loving. Without warning, the calloused, rough fingers grabbed my thumb and swiftly yanked off the nail. I screamed, involuntarily, and fell of the bed in a heap. I could hear the sickening sound of teeth crunching and a soft, childlike giggle coming from my bed. I ran out the door and jumped in my car parked outside. I drove all that night and most of the next day until I made it home. I still imagined that hideous, emaciated man following me. The fear kept me awake all the way home. After I parked in my driveway, I was briefly terrified by the sudden buzz of my phone. I answered it, hearing the voice of the ranger on the other end. "Hey, we went down to the ridge where you camped, found 2 tents down there, but nobody around," he said, his voice making it clear he was holding something back. "2 tents?" I asked, voice trembling. "Yeah, one blue and one green, both torn to ribbons." I felt dizzy with fear, knowing that the other tent must be mine. He must have taken it, set it all up again, but why? "We found your pack," the ranger continued quietly. "We can arrange to have it sent to you." I thanked him profusely for his help and hung up. It's been 3 months since this terrible nightmare, and I still haven't gotten a good night's sleep. Worst of all, I still find that sporadically, I'll lose random belongings. A sock here and there, a pencil I set down a few minutes earlier, and it's driving me mad. I'm not sure I'll ever feel safe being alone again. But I know for sure I'm not going camping ever again. If you thought that was bad, the next story will make you question what's real. I decided to visit my grandparents' old house and found something there waiting for me. I think something most people can relate to is the odd paranoia of sleeping at a grandparent's house in the middle of nowhere. The nights are so quiet and eerie. It always feels like something is watching you just outside of your field of vision, but close enough for you to see some movement in the peripheral. When I was a kid, I used to frequent my grandparents' house on a large wooded estate in some rural mountains. There were always stories that a man had died in that house, but who knows if that's even true. These days, I don't remember much about those nights, but I do remember always seeing some being outside the door to the room I would sleep in. It would sit on the roof and look in from the top of the door frame. It would just sit there and watch. It would be gone by sunrise, but there would always be a mysterious puddle of liquid where it hung. For the longest time, I convinced myself it was just childish superstitions, nothing more than my younger brain making me see things. Recently, however, I got the chance to revisit the old house, and those memories of that thing just pried at my mind. My grandparents both died years ago, and their house was simply left to rot away. I was passing through that area and decided to stop in the little town nearby to relive some childhood memories. Fuck, I wish I just kept driving. I used to head into the town with my grandparents just to look around, grab something to eat from the local diner at the corner. There wasn't much to do, but it was quaint, and I enjoyed it. Driving through the town now, though, everything just seemed so off. There was a strange whistle as the cold wind blew through the town, lifting up the snow on the sidewalk. The old diner had closed down and was left abandoned on the corner. There weren't many people walking around the main road, which was odd considering that place used to be quite busy this time of day. But it had been years since I visited. Maybe people just moved away. I don't exactly blame them. Like I said, the town was quaint and generally felt disconnected from the world. Some found it peaceful, others lonely. I took one of the back roads leading towards the house. The sun was setting at this point. The dense forest on either side of the road was getting darker and colder by the minute. On the side of the road was a ripped open deer. It had been freshly killed. I guess nature never sleeps. It was about here I got a strange chill through my entire body. It felt like tons of tiny pinpricks were stabbing me across my entire body. I started to see eyes in the trees and heard whispers in the wind. I started shaking, despite the fact the inside of my car wasn't even cold. I considered turning around, which in retrospect was what I should have done. But I felt something pulling me back to that house. I pulled into the long winding driveway and slowly made my way up to the front of the house. It was in shambles. Parts of the roof had fallen in, some of the windows seemed broken into, the door was ripped off its hinges in an unnatural way. What the hell? I thought. Had someone robbed this place at some point? I stepped out of my car and the frost whipped my skin. The cold dark felt ever encroaching. I could barely see 25 feet in front of me, the only source of light being my dim car headlights. Those went out, and I was left in a freezing blackness that consumed me. I heard voices in the trees all around me, beckoning me toward them. I switched on my flashlight and started to walk up to the house. The porch creaked with every step. There were tons of holes in it, and familiar claw marks were all over at and the broken door. My heart stopped. Was there some animal inside? Whatever it was, it had to be long dead by now. The house was silent except for my paranoid breathing. I took my time looking around. After all, there were plenty of memories to be reminisced on. I would cook with my grandma in the kitchen. I was never too good at it, but I was young and nothing really mattered yet. My grandpa would show me his hunting rifles in his trophy room. Stuffed deer heads lined the walls. Back then, they were all marks of a great huntsman. Now, they just felt creepy, their dead beady eyes staring into me. A noise. From the kitchen. The hairs on my neck stood up. Something was inside the house with me. I picked up one of the old guns and prayed to God it still worked. I slowly peeked around the corner of the doorway, staring into the abyss of the darkened kitchen. I couldn't see much, but it was impossible to discern actual movement from anxious mind tricks. I closed the door and waited in the trophy room a bit. Footsteps. I put my ear up to the door. They were right outside it. My heart dropped, and I could feel it pounding in my throat. A sweat broke out on my forehead. They came up to the door, and then slowly trailed off into the distance. I waited a good 15 minutes, just listening to the silence to make sure the coast was clear. Someone or something was definitely inside with me. I finally gathered up the courage to peek through the crack in the door. Nothing, at least as far as I could tell. I slowly creeped out into the main room, shotgun pointed out directly in front of me. At this point, my heart was pounding inhumanly fast. My entire body was shaking, due to the cold or the fear. I wasn't sure. I should have left then, but I had to check one last thing before I left. Either way, it seemed like whatever was inside had left. I couldn't hear any noises anywhere in the house. I came to the stairs leading up to the second floor. I had to look in the room I used to sleep in one last time, just for nostalgia's sake. I still had the shotgun in my hands, although I relaxed a little now. There were only 3 rooms on the second floor. My grandparents' bedroom, the guest bedroom where I stayed, and the upstairs bathroom. I didn't care much to look anywhere else but the guest room. I had spent so many nights there. The room had been ingrained into memory. As I began to step over towards it, I heard another step above me, in the attic. My heart started beating again. My skin was littered with goosebumps. I had to check. I pulled down the old ladder and slowly made my way up it. I stared into the darkness of the attic. I couldn't see my hands in front of face, but I could hear something. Not 30 feet from me, something was eating something. I heard bones crunching and flesh being torn. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it towards the sound. Holy shit! There, now staring directly at me, was whatever creature I used to see those late nights when I was a kid. It was completely real and physical. It was a bony humanoid creature. Its eyes were a piercing white, its skin a disgusting pale, and its teeth rotting and razor sharp. Blood dripped from its mouth, and I saw it was eating a dead deer corpse. It let out a nauseating screech that caused me to fall down from the ladder. If it hadn't been for how panicked I was, it might have got me. I screamed and scrambled back to my feet. I ran and tried to shoot the thing. The damn gun didn't even work. I ran to the only place I could think to stay, the guest room. I ran inside, the door fallen off its hinges. I got a second to catch my breath and realized I had no idea where that thing was. My mind was racing. My body was violently shaking. I tried to think off where it could have gone. Then I remembered how it used to sit on the ceiling. I peeked up at the ceiling, and sure enough it sat. Claws sank into the roof, just waiting. It wasn't able to come into the room. I tried to possibly think why, but I couldn't come up with anything at the moment. I couldn't walk outside the room. I couldn't jump out the window, lest I wanted to risk an injury from the second floor. Plus, that thing would probably run out after me. I looked around for something to use. There was nothing there. I opened the closet, and I screamed as a corpse fell out from the closet. It was rotten and old, and I vomited on the spot. This was a person who had died here years ago, probably because of the creature. And this was why I assumed the creature couldn't climb into the room. His corpse held a small vial of an unknown substance. It looked like some kind of powder or incense, some strange concoction that kept that thing away. It made sense to me now why that creature never entered all those years ago. That man's body was always in the closet. I just never bothered to look inside. My shaky hand picked up the vial and sprinkled some out into the hall. The creature screeched again, causing me a pounding headache. This stuff kept it out, and that's all I needed to know. I've now been sitting in this room for 2 hours. That thing hasn't left, no matter how much of the incense I sprinkle out into the hall. The dead corpse is still rotting next to me, and I'm still freezing in the darkness. I don't know what to do. I'm going to have to leave eventually. But I don't want to become the thing that's the source of the liquid dripping from the ceiling. The fear only gets worse from here. The next story will prove it. It all started with a small nip at my ankle in the middle of the night. I was half asleep when the pain came. I jumped at the small sting but didn't stop moving. I needed to go to the washroom. Nothing else mattered at the moment. After finishing my task, I paused in the well-lit room to glance at my ankle. I wet down a cloth to clean away a small bit of blood. At the time, I assumed my ankle had caught on the edge of my bed, or the lid of a storage bin under it. I never would have guessed what actually happened that night, or how much danger I was in. I work 3 jobs at the moment, 1 full-time job, 1 part-time, and another, which I only get 3 hours on Sunday. I barely have enough time to get from one job to another, let alone relax. My main goal is to save up, buy a house, and retire early. It's depressing that this simple dream is nearly impossible for people my age. I'm currently renting a room in a small 3-floor condo. There were 3 of us, but the one roommate moved out. Our landlord wants to redo the basement to turn it into another space to rent. I need to find a new place before that happens. I'm barely sleeping as is. I don't think I could handle more people in this place if they were all like Ryan. I've had a suspicion that Ryan pays his rent by less than legal means. In this economy, you need to do what you need to cover your bills. I disliked him because he committed every bad roommate sin. He was loud at night, smoked in his room, ate food that wasn't his, brought friends over on the weekends and let them stay for days, and sometimes didn't flush. That was what bothered me the most. I hated going all day downstairs at night to use the small washroom to avoid the mess Ryan left behind. Of course, I told my landlord all this, but he hasn't done anything about it, aside from bothering Ryan to not smoke in the house. I was exhausted from dealing with too many hours at work and a terrible roommate. Even so, I should have taken some events more seriously. It was 2 a.m. I got home from work. Collapsing in bed, I was ready to pass out before I got ready for another shift. Some scratching kept me awake. What was Ryan doing? Did he get a pet while I was gone? Raising my tired head, I carefully listened. The scratching sound wasn't coming from his room but nearby. I realized it came from under my bed. Did we have mice? That would be annoying. I got out of bed and grabbed my phone for a flashlight. An odd sound came, as if something large bumped into the bottom of the bed frame. My heart jumped as I glanced around expecting to see a wild animal. Nothing. There was a lack of dust bunnies even though I haven't cleaned recently. One of my storage bins had been slightly moved. I didn't see any other traces of an animal or the cause of the scratching noise. I did hear Ryan start blasting god-awful music in his room. Sighing, I got up to go down the hallway. His bedroom door was right across from mine. When our doors were open, you could see our beds from the hallway. I pounded on his door, asking him to keep it down. The music was lowered, but not turned off. His excuse was he didn't know I was home. He was still making some noise, but I was able to fall asleep. I wasn't expecting to see Ryan that morning because he normally crawled out of bed after I left for work. I saw him pacing the kitchen, waiting for me, agitated. "Dude, I know you don't like me, but you can't take my stuff," he said, sounding annoyed. He looked like he didn't sleep. That was the only way he would be up around this time. "What are you talking about?" I said, wondering if I used the last of his condiments by accident. "Come on, don't be like that. All of my socks are missing and 3 bags of my product are gone." I raised an eyebrow. Who would want his disgusting unwashed socks? I shook my head, figuring he just misplaced them. Have you checked your entire room? Maybe it's... I started, but he cut me off. I know you need the money, but I have customers waiting on that stuff. He was getting angry, which was not how I wanted to start my day. Who would I sell your weed to? And it's legal now. Why would anyone get it from me? I don't have the connections you do to start with. And I don't even want to look at your dirty laundry, let alone touch it. I shrugged. He narrowed his eyes at me, letting the thought run through his head. He saw me as too much of a nerd to have friends who did cool things like smoking his product. I had been the only person in the house since he noticed it was missing. Unless it was in his room somewhere, he didn't understand where his things went off to. I don't want to accuse your friends, but would any of them copy your key and take this stuff as a prank? I didn't know how often Ryan left the house. Then again, he slept like the dead, so someone could walk right into his room and take anything while he was passed out. This answer made more sense to him than his roommate suddenly stealing from him. Maybe. But if I find out it's you, there will be hell to pay. He threatened. I didn't take him seriously. After all, I wasn't stealing his stuff. We requested to get our locks changed, and I hoped that would put an end to all of this. A few days later, Ryan's product appeared in the middle of the hallway, the bags ripped open. I saw it the moment he was coming out of his room to use the washroom. I just got home. He saw me in my uniform and didn't see any traces of his premium weed on my clothing. So, I was in the clear. We spent the next hour making sure there wasn't an animal living in the condo and all the entrances were sealed. If we heard noises, we would need to call a pest control company to deal with it. I really thought we had figured it out. It was either an animal we hadn't seen or one of his friends. Another week went by. Every day Ryan seemed to get more and more agitated. None of my things went missing or were tampered with. I didn't own much. The few storage bins kept winter clothing because I didn't have a dresser. All my dirty laundry went into a basket, and I kept my clean stuff in another basket. Aside from some important papers and books, I didn't have anything of importance in my room for someone to mess with. No wonder they went to Ryan's room first. It was cluttered with useless high-end items. Countless never-worn shoes. So many LED lights and a layer of clothing collecting dust on his floor. How did he even notice his socks were missing in that mess? I had been hearing scratches at night, but when I turned on the lights, it stopped. I thought I was just hearing things because we found no traces of our mystery animal. It all came to a head during one of my rare nights off and when a storm hit. I couldn't work, even if I had a shift. Powerful winds with heavy rain kept most people off the road. Thunder rumbled outside. The power went out, leaving the only light the constant flashes of the storm. I was worried about the food in the fridge. For once, I was glad Ryan had eaten most of it. I made a sandwich before the lunch meat got too warm and headed upstairs only to be confronted by my roommate. He was standing in the middle of the hallway, holding his phone to use as a flashlight. I had gotten a battery-powered lantern in case the power went out like tonight. "What's up?" I asked him. A pressure started behind my eyes. My body knew this encounter would end in a migraine. "Where's all my stuff? My phone cords are gone. More socks, sheets, blankets. I had a bunch of gold chains. I put a camera in my room, but I don't know how you messed that up too." That was odd. He hadn't had any friends over since the locks were changed. I wasn't taking his stuff, so where was it going? "You've cleaned your room?" I suggested. He slapped my food out of my hand, which I wasn't pleased by. He stomped a foot and gestured towards his door. "It's a small-ass room. Where do you think it's hiding?" He shot back. This time I put my foot down as well. "I can smell your mess from here. You don't clean at all. Your room is a biohazard, and I have no idea how you live in that. God, when was the last time you even showered?" On top of all my hours, I was the only person who cleaned the common areas. Ryan created a mess and never helped with chores. He only cleaned out the fridge. He never stole my body wash, though, because he never baths. He must be misplacing his stuff because no one would want it because of the smell. That has nothing to do with anything. I pay for my room and I can do whatever I want with it. My friends aren't taking my shit, and if you claim you're not, then what? Some little gremlin shows up in the middle of the night to take it? His face was red from anger, and he raised his cell phone, blinding me for a second. Christ, and can you get rid of that tacky Halloween decoration under your bed? It scares the shit out of me every time I go piss in the middle of the night. I frowned. What was he talking about? I turned my head to follow his eyes, my adjusting to the darkness. I normally kept my bedroom door open when I wasn't at home or sleeping. An unfamiliar white shape was under my bed, squished between it and the floor. It must be what Ryan had been seeing the past few weeks. My heart started to race in fear, and I found myself taking a few steps backwards until Ryan was in front of me. "That's not a mask," I whispered, too scared to think of anything else to say. We were both staring at a pale, smiling face staring at us sideways. It did look a little like a Halloween mask. The grin was unnaturally wide, the eyes dark and so many teeth. After I spoke, everything moved in slow motion. The thing bolted from under the bed, a small body crawling at lightning speeds on all fours towards us. Ryan screamed and immediately tripped. I was on the first step downward when I heard his body fall. I should have kept going, and yet I turned around to grab his arms, trying to drag him away. The small monster grabbed his legs and pulled him out of my grasp. I was shocked by how strong it was. My roommate started to cry and kick, unable to get away. The monster paused to make eye contact with me for a second. Long, greasy black hair covered part of her face. Pointed ears came out from under the black strains, and the skin was pale, almost waxy. She was wrapped in one of Ryan's stolen sheets. With an almost childlike grin, she started to drag a man twice her size into my room. His nails dug into the wood floor. I grabbed his wrists, only to be pulled along with him. He begged me not to let go when his legs disappeared under the bed. I heard awful crunching sounds as his screams of fear turned into screams of pain. No matter how hard I struggled, I simply was not strong enough to save him. To my horror, my hands gave out, and I watched him slip under my bed, never to be seen again. The moment he was gone, I shoved the bed out of the way, looking for him. Nothing. Just a normal floor between the pushed-aside storage bins. I couldn't help Ryan now, so I took the coward's way out. I left. I drove to work and parked my car. I couldn't head inside, so I just hung out in the parking lot watching the storm, wondering what the hell just happened. I avoided my place for a while. After couch hopping for a week or so, I knew I needed to get back home. The place was as I left it. The sandwich Ryan had knocked out of my hands rotted in the hallway. The nail marks were still on the floor, and his room was silent. I wanted to think I was crazy, that this didn't happen, but I needed to know for sure. It was hard, but I climbed into bed, eyes staring at the ceiling, waiting. Hours passed, and I started to drift to sleep. I heard something and went to sit up when I felt a weight on my chest pinning me down. The pale, white, grinning face greeted me. The creature was on the smaller side, maybe 5 feet at the most. She was dressed in torn sheets and rags that smelled like something rotten and a bit like Ryan's room. Her hands were pitch black with dangerous claws. The rags were wrapped around a plump body that knocked the wind from my chest when she sat on me. I knew I was going to be ripped apart if I didn't act fast. I had prepared for this. As her mouth came down ready to tear into my face, I grabbed a fistful of bacon I had cooked beforehand. I shoved it in her mouth and then was able to scramble aside, still on the bed, watching her reaction. Confusion was on her face at first. Soon she furiously chewed the food she was given. She jumped on the container with the rest of the treat beside my pillow. I watched her, a bit shocked. My plan worked. I mean, who doesn't like bacon? When she finished, her small face sniffed around looking for more. She had calmed down and only nipped at my fingers to say she was still hungry. I think I can handle this. It's not as if I haven't dealt with feeding a roommate before. The little creature that came out from under my bed at night was still scary as hell, but she warmed up a little to me. I couldn't afford to move. Taking food home from work or buying roasted chickens appeared to solve my problem of not getting eaten like my previous roommate. At least for a while. It wasn't that simple. A week of only normal food got to her. I found her collapsed in the hallway, appearing weak and ill. She snapped at my hand when I tried to move her somewhere more comfortable. The dark thought came to me that I wasn't feeding her what she needed to live. I looked her over, debating on what to do. I could call someone, maybe the police to take her away. But would she come back and kill me for that? Would she be able to fight them off? Even weakened, if she wanted to, she could kill me. What were my options here? Wait until she turned on me? If I stopped giving her meals, I knew for certain I would be her next one. I don't regret what I did next. I rode along on a bike I borrowed from Ryan, knowing he wouldn't miss it, with a duffel bag on my back. I was careful to avoid main roads and anywhere that someone might see me. The straps of the bag dug into my shoulders, and sometimes a sharp kick came at my back. I finally stopped a few blocks away from my location and parked the bike. Carefully, I lowered the bag to the ground, opening it to let the contents free. The small creature darted out, racing towards a large car shadow. She gave me a grin before her body sank into the darkness. A few months ago, a coworker of mine harassed an underage cashier we all saw as a little sister. She ended up quitting, and he got fired for a different offense. I've heard he's still sending her messages and bothering her. I once gave him a ride home before I was aware of the kind of person he was. Should his actions be a death sentence? No, probably not. Ryan didn't deserve what happened to him. I wasn't sure what a person needed to be worthy of a gruesome death at the claws of that small monster. I don't know the full extent of her powers. I think she has a limit distance-wise. She couldn't just appear under my old coworker's bed. I had to bring her a few blocks away. How many more people will need to suffer at her hands? And how many people would I sacrifice to save my own skin? I wondered how long it would take for the police to catch on. I bet she would eat me in my prison cell, causing a bit of a fuss for others to clean up. Yes, I was scared of her, and of dying. I wanted a simple life and to just relax. And yet, I felt an odd fondness towards her growing. I started to want to see her cheerful reactions after I gave her a tasty snack. Was that some sort of power she had, or was I just messed up in the head? Does the answer really matter? After her meal, she came back to me covered in blood. I put her inside the duffel bag, glad I bought it at a thrift store so I could throw it away. When we were home, I struggled to get her in a bath and then in clean sheets. My body screamed from exhaustion. I didn't know how long I could keep this up. Her small body crawled into bed, tucking next to mine like a cat. Yeah, I must be messed up for the sight of my sleeping new roommate making me happy. Hold on tight, because the next story will make your heart race even faster. The Lives I Lost Between Deaths, Part 2. I woke up, choking and gasping like a fish out of water. My screams erupted, raw and desperate, mingling with the pain that coursed through me. It took agonizing minutes for me to regain a semblance of control, my cries morphing into sobs of horror. Please, please, someone make it stop, I begged, tears streaming down my face in a torrent of anguish. The physical pain of my death was excruciating, but the emotional devastation of losing Myra overshadowed it all. Her struggle, the fear in her eyes as she fought for air, those memories haunted me relentlessly. I still wake up screaming some nights, reliving the moments that played like a twisted film reel in my mind. As my screams subsided into ragged breaths, a familiar voice pulled me back from the edge of despair. Jude, honey, please calm down. Shh. Myra had awakened beside me, her eyes wide with concern. She clung to my arm, her own fear reflecting in her gaze. At that moment, I realized the fragile thread of our reality, and the terror of losing her lingered like an unshakable shadow. When I looked into her terrified eyes, a fresh wave of sobs overtook me, softer this time. Tears of exhaustion, relief, and deep, aching pain. Myra? I cried, my voice cracking as I reached out to pull her into a deep embrace. Her warmth enveloped me, and I could hear her quiet sniffles, a reflection of the fear she must have felt, waking up next to a man in such distress. After what felt like an eternity, I sluggishly slid out of bed, huffing and sniffling all the way to the bathroom. I needed to wash my face, to rid myself of the traces of my breakdown in front of my helpless girlfriend. As I glanced in the mirror, I was met with a sight that made my heart sink. My eyes were puffy, my face swollen and red, a testament to the emotional storm that had just passed. I leaned down, turned on the cold water, and splashed it over my face repeatedly, hoping to cleanse away the remnants of my tears. But when I looked up again, something felt off. That's not my face, I mumbled, staring at the stranger reflected back at me. It bore a striking resemblance to my brother, not Jesse, but someone who could easily be mistaken for me. If we stood side by side in public, someone might even think we were doppelgangers. The similarity was uncanny, as if someone had tried to sketch my likeness from memory. But I knew what this was, just another twist in the nightmare that had become my life after each painful death. Fuck, I shouted, slamming my hands down onto the ceramic sink in frustration. Anger surged through me like a wildfire. Myra rushed in with a cup of water, concern etched across her face. "Jude, please come to the living room," she urged gently. I nodded and followed her to the couch, our bodies angled toward each other in a mix of worry and comfort. I struggled to meet her gaze, the weight of my truth pressing down on me. After a tense silence, she finally spoke. "What happened?" Her voice was filled with genuine concern. I took a deep breath, knowing I had to tread carefully. How could I explain this? "I sometimes have these vivid night terrors," I began, trying to soften the blow. "It all started when I was 7. I crawled into a dresser drawer during a game of hide-and-seek and suffocated to death. My brother Jesse was the seeker, but he never found me. Not until it was too late." I paused, my throat tightening with the memory. I had never openly shared this before, but after nearly losing her, I felt she deserved to know. I woke up in my bed after dying, screaming and crying to my mom about what had happened. She comforted me, but when I told her Jesse wasn't able to find me, she asked me who Jesse was. I glanced down at the glass of water, the gravity of my past weighing heavily on my heart. "Wait, you told me Jesse suffocated in a dresser and died. You didn't want me to bring him up because it would upset your family," she said, her brow furrowed in concern. "I know, Myra. But how do you explain this without sounding like a lunatic?" I pleaded, searching her eyes for understanding. She looked at me intently, as if silently urging me to continue. "When I was 13, I went to a party at a lake with friends. We were drinking, and someone dared me to jump off a 15-foot cliff. I was drunk and wanted to look tough. But when I jumped, I hit shallow water and broke my neck, shattered my skull, and I died." I took a shaky breath, bracing myself for her reaction. She was just listening, her focus unwavering. "I woke up in a wet field after that. I got a ride home, and when I walked through the front door, there was Beans, the dog I had never seen before. He appeared in my life as quickly as Jesse had disappeared. I started writing everything down, trying to make sense of it all. But I was just a kid. It messed me up." I fidgeted with my hands, uncertain about how much more I should reveal. "And you had another one?" She encouraged me to continue, her voice steady. "Yeah, it was the worst one." I tried to steady my breath. "You and I were on our way to meet Maddie. We decided to take a back road, and while crossing a bridge, I inhaled deeply, the memories rushing back. It broke, and we fell in. Myra, you died in my arms," I confessed, tears streaming down my cheeks as I struggled to articulate the horror. "We drowned in the car. I can't explain the details. Please don't ask me to relive that," I begged. She shook her head, gently wiping a tear from my cheek. "Has anything changed this time?" Her sincerity cut through my despair. "My face," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's not mine. It's close, but I don't have the same nose or eyes. My features look like someone tried to draw me from memory. Imagine looking in the mirror at a stranger. I don't want to live like this anymore." Myra scooted closer, her warmth radiating against me as she clung to my arm. "Jude, we'll figure this out. I can't imagine what you've gone through, but you need to know that in my world, this is the face I fell in love with. You're my savior. I love you." Her words wrapped around me like a lifeline. We spent the rest of the night together, talking through the complex feelings I had never been able to face alone. It hurt deeply, but having her by my side felt like a light on my damaged soul. I added the incident to my journal, which I started at 14. It hurt deeply to know this was a problem that wouldn't just go away. The PTSD lingered from the deaths I'd been through. I woke up crying, kicking, and screaming regularly. Nowhere near the level of when I died, but it always startled Myra when she stayed over. I felt guilty for killing her. It was an accident, but she was at risk just by being with me. Myra had died in the reality I lived in before this one. She looked the same and acted the same. But how long would this Myra exist? Until I died again, leaving her behind to suffer. It changed how I saw people, how I saw her. I wanted more than anything to marry her, but she had to know it would most likely be temporary. I would love her as deeply as I could until she vanished. I decided to write her a note, something she could hold on to when I was gone. I scribbled the letter, tears blurring the words, knowing she would read it someday. I folded it carefully and placed it in a wooden box, hiding it in my closet. That night, I decided to buy her a ring and propose. I couldn't think of losing her. I had to focus on loving her, here and now. I picked out a dainty ring for her delicate fingers, and a few weeks later, I asked her to wear her favorite dress. We returned to the art gallery where we first met, and when we reached her favorite section, I knelt down. "Will you marry me?" She said yes. We decided on a courthouse wedding. Small, just like her. October 10th, the day we became husband and wife, she wore a beautiful white sweater dress, her hair loose, her eyes bright. I did my best to look presentable, even with the face I was still learning to accept as mine. After we got our certificate, we went to the park, sitting by the lake, feeding ducks. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the wooden box. "Myra," I said, a little nervous, "this is yours to hold on to." She cupped it gently. "What is it?" she asked, starting to open it. "No, you can't," I said softly, brushing her hand aside. "Only when I'm gone." I didn't use the word death, but she understood. She nodded, her eyes full of that familiar understanding. She kissed me gently, then rested her head on my shoulder. We sat in silence, the fall breeze whispering around us. She was my wife. I was her husband. And I loved her more than anyone I had ever loved before. I was 23, and she was 24, when she came into the living room with a small stick in her hand. She held it up close enough for me to see the two faint gray lines. She was pregnant. It was a difficult moment for me. I was overjoyed that we would finally have a child together. But fear quickly crept in. What kind of father would I be if I even got the chance to be one? She wanted to keep the baby, and who was I to tell her no? I knew she would be a wonderful mother, and if I could, I would try my best to be a father. But deep down, there was an inkling I couldn't shake, that I would never meet this child. 6 months into the pregnancy, my worst fear came true. Myra died from preeclampsia. It killed her and our daughter, and the doctors couldn't save either of them. I knew eventually, Myra would vanish from my life. But not like this. Not like this. Even now, it's hard for me to describe the pain. I had hoped that if anyone were to leave, it would be me, and she would stay, healthy and young, with her whole life ahead of her. But she didn't get a second chance. My world shattered in a way I had never experienced before. The time that followed is just a blur. I could barely get out of bed in the morning, and most days I didn't even bother. It lasted for months, until my sister, Maddie, came to take care of me like I was some kind of hospice patient. She was a godsend. She cooked, cleaned, helped with bills. Maddie and I had always been close, but what she did for me during that time, it was more than I could have ever asked for. One day, while cleaning up the bedroom and sorting through old things, she pulled a little wooden box out of the closet. "Do you need this?" she asked, trying to clear out things I might no longer want. My heart sank. I had completely forgotten about the letter I had written for Myra. It had been 3 years since I had sat down to write it. "Yes, I need that. Actually, just give it to me. I want to keep it," I said, trying to stay calm. I took the box from her hands, then grabbed my keys from the table by the front door. "Where are you going?" Maddie asked, confused. "I'll be back." "I'm fine," I replied, quickly heading out to my car. I drove straight to Myra and Lily's gravesite. Her name was going to be Lily. When I arrived, I knelt down beside them, the letter clutched tightly in my hand. I opened it and began reading, my voice shaky, struggling to keep it together. "Myra, if you're reading this, you are my wife. It also means that I'm gone. I've left this world behind, and I hope that this time you weren't afflicted by the curse that haunts my ever-changing life. I want you to know that although I have left this world, I have started over in a new one. I have already woken up somewhere, and hopefully you are by my side. You are the only person who I have ever tried to explain this to, and your heart has changed my life for the better. My life is hard. I know it sounds a little melodramatic, but it's the truth. I know that I can rest easy, knowing that you are safe from the torturous cycle I am forced to live through. I hope you can find someone who will take care of you this time around. You have done more for me than anyone has ever dared to. You are a strong woman who deserves a life full of love and happiness. If you love me, even a fraction of the love I have for you, I know this is going to hurt badly. I know you will cry, and I know you will always question the night terrors I've shared with you. And that's okay. Just wish for me that you didn't disappear from my life as I have yours. I am sorry. I am truly sorry, Myra, and I love you. Jude. The context of the letter had completely flipped. I had never once considered that I could lose someone naturally. Nothing about my life had been natural up to this point. Yet there I was, sitting beside her grave, my chest hollow, my world shattered. I stayed until the sky turned black and the stars appeared, flickering above us like silent spectators to my grief. I didn't want to leave her side ever again. Something in me finally broke. That night, I made a decision I knew was crazy, but I didn't care anymore. I thought back to the time I died, jumping off that cliff, Beans appearing like he'd always been there. If I died again, maybe Myra would come back. Maybe the twisted rules of this existence would offer me that one mercy. There were no rules I understood in this game, but what did I have to lose? I had infinite chances, didn't I? An infinite number of times to find her again. The first time I tried, I went out with a bang. I'll spare the details, but I thought it would work. Like every time before, I woke up gasping, panting, alive. Only this time when I came to, I was still sitting at her gravesite. It was the next morning. My head spun with disbelief. I begged and pleaded, praying to whatever gods might be listening. Please, please bring her back. I'll do anything to see her face one more time. I tried again. When I woke up the second time, in the same place, I cursed the sky, screamed until my throat burned, and threw a tantrum like a child denied their most precious thing. I never got what I wanted. I never got what I needed. It finally hit me. She wasn't coming back. Not this time. I didn't know what else to do but run. I drained my savings, closed the account, and disappeared. I drove to a bus station, left my car, and rode until I was sure no one would ever find me. I ended up in a small town in the Midwest. Population 400. I bought a house with fake documents I paid far too much for. I laid low for years. No friends, no family, no going out. I wasn't about to risk contact with anyone who might recognize me, or worse, anyone I loved. What had changed after I died twice? My face, the one I barely recognized since that night, remained the same, but everything else felt fragile. So I kept it simple. No changes, no complications. A quiet life, hoping that if I stayed hidden, nothing could harm me again. It worked for years. I was content being a hollowed-out version of myself, a shell of who I once was. It felt safer that way. Safer than trying to love again. Safer than hoping. I died again when I was 34. Hit by a car on my way home from the grocery store. Pathetic, really. The kind of death that doesn't even make headlines. When I woke up, the only thing that had changed was the layout of my house. It wasn't a massive shift, just enough to throw me off balance for a moment. It confirmed what I already suspected. Whatever this was, it was just to mess with me. The world didn't change, just the scenery. And honestly, that was a welcome change. Something new, something unfamiliar, even if it was only my furniture rearranged by some cosmic force. But over time, I grew bitter. More bitter than I ever thought possible. What really fucked me up was the fact that no one else's life was touched by this madness. The neighbors carried on like always, completely unaware. It drove me insane that their lives were safe and steady, while I was trapped in this twisted cycle. They were untouched by my existence, unless I made the mistake of befriending them. As long as I kept my distance, they were safe from whatever curse had latched onto me. The only thing that kept me going was the fact that I had no choice. I even thought at one point, this wouldn't even be that bad if I could just start over every time. A newborn can't remember anything. And why did I have to remember all of these horrific moments? What had I done to deserve such a shitty existence? I don't know. I won't ever know. How could I know? The next few times I died, they were all my choice. Once I took a toaster in the bath, just because I could. It hurt a lot. Next, I decided to hang myself. That also was not very fun, so I decided to quit experimenting with it and to keep up the avoidance of death. I realized that no matter how much I hated living, I hated dying more. My depression was arguably worse than anyone's ever had been. But what could I do? I had to live with the truth that this would never end. So, I tried something new. Rather than making connections with people, I turned to gardening. Myra loved plants, so I bought some for the house and started a small tomato patch in the backyard. I even put up a tall privacy fence so no one, neither people nor animals, could see inside. It helped more than I expected. I realized that no matter what changed, I could always have plants. If one went missing or died, I could simply get another. It was something I could control, and that small truth has held up, even now. I'm 63 years old. As I grow older, I can't help but fear what might happen when I reach 90. Will I finally get to rest, or will I be forced to live forever, cursed to watch my body continue to decay while I stay conscious inside it? I'm no Edward from Twilight. I'm aging. Someone would eventually notice a 400-year-old pile of dust walking around town. But what if I start over again from the beginning? Will I be Jude once more? Do I get a chance at a normal life next time? I don't know. Those are the thoughts that haunt me every day. I've been forced into a life of suffering, so I'm doing my best to survive it. I have my plants, and I know Myra would be proud of that. Jessie would be proud. Beans too. I hold on to them in my heart as tight as I can. I know I'll die again, likely of something natural. Strokes, heart attacks, whatever finally takes the body down. But maybe that's the key. Natural causes. Maybe that's what'll finally end this. I guess I won't know until the lights go out for good, or until I wake up in that cold bed once more. All I ask is that you think of me, because I can't think of you. I don't have that luxury. If someone, in this universe or the next, reads these words, it's the only thing I have left. I'm sorry I can't be your friend. Pray to whatever you believe in that when you die, you don't come back. I hope your souls rest easy when your time comes. I don't feel the same bitterness I used to. At some point, I realized it only made me more miserable than I was already forced to be. Some days are harder than others, but I'll get through them somehow. If you thought that was creepy, the next tale will make you want to leave the lights on. The burning cars on I-10. Every day and every night of the week I made the same commute for almost 3 years. I used to work at the Motiva refinery in Port Arthur, but I live in Mont Belvieu, always have. It's an hour drive, but it was simple enough. Just a straight shot down I-10 till you get to Winnie and take the exit onto Highway 73, taking you right into Port Arthur. I've driven that stretch of road so many times, I could tell you anything you'd ever want to know about it. All the spots to fill up on gas, where to get a bite to eat, every name of every tiny town from Wallaceville to Hancomer to Stowell. But that's not why I'm posting here. I don't like to think, much less talk about that drive anymore if I can help it. If it can be avoided, I never drive east. At least, not that route. I'll take the extra hour. Hell, I'll take 5 if it means I never have to drive that length of I-10 again. I'm only revisiting this memory that I've tried my best to bury for the sake of warning anyone living in the area, anyone traveling through there. A detour may be well worth your while. That drive nearly cost me my life. It's the very reason I quit working at that refinery. If I'm still breathing after what I saw, I ought to do what I can to tell people about it. Might save someone a brush with the Reaper, might not. Maybe they've moved on to someplace else. Either way, I like to think this is worth talking about. If nothing else comes of it, at the very least, it might help me come to terms with what happened. It started off unassuming enough. 2 months ago, almost to the day, I was making my way home from work. I was tired, hungry, and ready for a shower. But even in such a state, there was no mistaking what I saw. There's a part of the drive between Winnie and Mont Belvieu where there's little activity, especially at night. You don't see too many other drivers, or much of anything really, till you get close to Lake Anahuac. About halfway along that quiet stretch of road is where I saw it. An orange glow, off in the distance, slowly getting closer. I could just make out the pillar of black smoke rising above it, cutting through the dark blue of the night sky. As I closed the distance, the details of the scene became clear. It was a car, completely overtaken by fire, sitting in the median strip of the highway. At least, it had once been a car. There was little left of it besides the bones. After taking in the sight for a second, something really struck me as strange. Nobody was around. No cops, no fire truck or ambulance, no signs that anything was out of the ordinary. When I passed by the wreck, I could feel the heat radiating off of it, even through the side of my truck. I had the brief thought to stop, see if anyone needed help, but there wasn't anybody on the side of the road, near the car, or further along. I came to the morbid conclusion that if someone was in that car and they hadn't already been picked up by somebody, they had gone up in smoke with the vehicle they were in. I've had to deal with fighting a few fires before. A refinery's not the safest place to work, after all, but I wasn't equipped to deal with something like this by myself. So I drove on home, accepting that if there was even anyone left to help, I wasn't the one to do it. When I got back to my apartment, I grabbed a beer, heated up some leftovers, and tried to not think about what I'd seen. But it was useless. For whatever reason, the image of that burning car had settled itself in my mind. There was something I found captivating about it. I questioned my decision to keep driving, my refusal to get involved. I tried to figure out what had happened with only that one piece of information, but it was futile. It felt like an incomplete picture, and I wasn't satisfied with any answer I could come to. They all felt wrong. This argument with myself went on for an hour or so before I tired my mind out and decided to go to sleep. That night, I saw the car again in a dream. I heard someone screaming from inside. I woke up in a pool of sweat, like my body felt the heat of the fire, even from within a nightmare. But I had no time to worry about that. I had to get ready and hit the road in an hour if I was going to make it to Port Arthur on time. It was another normal day at work, nothing out of the ordinary. I thought about telling my coworkers about what I'd seen, but decided not to. They weren't exactly a talkative bunch, and that kind of work doesn't inspire much in the way of conversation. It's hard. Thankless. Since I worked there for a while, they let me take longer shifts on weekdays to get guaranteed weekends off. Usually you're expected to be available any day of the week if they need you. I took the extra money, but I didn't see much of a difference besides that. I just got home later. I didn't do much with my free time anyway. The weekends always escaped me. When it came time to clock out, an anxious feeling started brewing between my temples. I got worried, wondering if I'd see something like that again tonight. I tried to shake it off, but it followed me outside, stopped me in my tracks when I reached to open my truck door. I felt silly. What are the chances of me seeing a thing like that again in my lifetime, much less 2 nights in a row? I asked myself. This question was enough to quiet my whining nerves, so I got in and drove off the lot to make my way home. If only I knew, the chances were already rigged in advance. I felt a knot come up in my throat when I made the switch from Highway 73 to I-10 in Winnie. I felt something else was going to happen that night. Another piece of that picture was waiting for me. As my truck glided along the asphalt, I scanned the sides of the road, looking for anything to confirm my aching suspicions. Then, near the same spot I'd seen that car the night before, almost down to the mile, I saw the same glow that haunted me all day. There was another car between the opposing sides of the interstate, cocooned in flame. But there was something different from the first wreck I'd seen. All around the car, a circle of people were holding hands. The sight of them standing there was enough to tip the scales. Curiosity weighed too heavy on me to let me keep driving without an answer. I came to a stop, parked my truck on the shoulder, and got out to ask them what was happening. But with every step, I started noticing some details about this group of strangers that made me slow my pace. They were all dressed in long black robes, and I couldn't make out any of their faces. Their features were obscured, even those facing the bright glow of the fire. They noticed me coming and had stopped holding hands. Once I felt I was in earshot, I had enough sense to stop my advance before I asked them, "What's going on here? Is anyone hurt?" They didn't offer any answer, all staying silent. There was a stomach-churning smell on the air, and it wasn't the smoke. I tried again. "I don't think it's a good idea to stand that close. Y'all might get hurt. I can call the police. Did any of you see what happened?" At this, they finally stirred, suddenly making their way towards me in unison. Like they all came to the same decision at once. I started backing away from them, saying with admittedly little confidence, "Easy now, stay back." This failed to slow their step, so I quickened mine. They didn't utter a single word, all steadily approaching with their shrouded gazes fixed on me. "I have a gun in my truck. I don't want to use it. Just calm down." I was lying, out of some desperate hope this might get them to reconsider their course, but not one of them paused at the threat. I gave up any hope of reasoning with them and turned to run back to my truck. As I did, I heard the scraping of boots across gravel as they began to chase after me. A couple dozen yards had never felt so far. Luckily, I had forgotten my keys in the truck's ignition. I've never been so thankful to be forgetful. I slammed the door shut and kicked the gas pedal to the ground, seeing flashes of them sprinting towards me in my right side mirror. As I took off, I felt a thud against the side of my truck. But I paid it no mind as I raced back up to the speed limit. I escaped, but that anxiety I felt at the refinery was nothing compared to the panic I was lost in at that moment. Every few seconds, my eyes darted from one mirror to another, looking to see if my pursuers had followed me in their own vehicle. After passing through Wallaceville about 15 minutes later, I finally eased up, figuring they hadn't been after me any longer. The thought brought me very little comfort. Even after concluding I hadn't been chased back home, I wasn't much less of a frantic mess when I reached my apartment. When I parked my truck, I was breathing sporadically, hesitant to get out, so I took some time to catch my breath. That was when I noticed it, as my eyes reflexively checked that right side mirror again. Something was sticking out of the side of my truck bed. Whatever ease I had settled into left me, my whole body tensed up at the sight of it. I slowly opened my door and walked to the back to see what it was. It was a knife. One of them jammed it into the side of my truck right before I drove off. That's how close they were. After struggling for a bit, I got the knife unwedged. It was a hunting knife, 8 inches long, still sharp even after being stabbed into the chassis of a truck. I ran into my apartment, dead-bolted the door, locked all my windows, and helplessly paced the floor, expecting I'd get a visit from those creeps at any second. Time seems to fly faster when your adrenaline's pumping, because it wasn't long before I saw it was midnight. I'd been obsessively looking through my window blinds for any shady figures, but it was as quiet as ever. I hadn't eaten anything yet, or even had a sip of water. That calmed me down some, but the whole time I ate, I couldn't stop looking at the knife, now laying on my coffee table. Sleep seemed impossible, but I tried my best in spite of that. It took half of one of my emergency trazodone pills and some deep breathing, but eventually I coasted into unconsciousness. I never dream when I take trazodone, but that night, I was right back on I-10, staring into that fire again. This time, those people were there, all in a circle around me. The last thing I remember was them staring at me, all screaming at the same deafening pitch. I woke to that same sensation of a bed soaked in sweat, still groggy from the sleep aid. I dreaded the idea of going back into work, but calling out the morning of had never gone over well before. At the time, I was convinced I couldn't afford to lose that job, and I had no reason that would be good enough for my manager. He was proud to be a bit of a taskmaster. That day at work was obnoxiously normal. Maybe I was looking for something extraordinary to happen, something to take my mind off of what I'd been through, but no. It was a typical, painfully slow day. When it came to an end, my body just wouldn't let me leave. I was frozen stiff at the thought of getting back into my truck. My manager noticed me standing there. To my surprise, he came up to me, and in a shocking moment of care, he gently asked, "What's got you troubled, son?" I tried to play it off, saying I just needed a moment of rest before I took the drive back to Mont Bellevue. He could tell I was lying. "Really? It seems like there's more to it than that. You're looking awful pale. You can tell me, I'm off for the night anyway." So, I told him everything. I was shocked that he believed me. He even gave me what seemed like some good advice. If those bastards were there around the same time, 2 nights in a row, they could be there again tonight. I'd say it's best that you stay here for a little while. Wait as long as you need, then head back home when you're ready. I'd never known him to be a man capable of being so warm, especially with his workers. so I decided to take advantage of this rare display of kindness. "Thank you, sir. I won't be too long, I just don't want to run into them again." He could tell how frightened I really was. "Just stay safe, son, and don't get out of your car no matter what you see. You just head straight home. Good night. See you on Monday." With all that was going on, I'd completely forgotten it was a Friday night. I waited there for an hour, a slow, patience-testing hour, but I refused to leave any sooner. When the clock finally read 10 p.m., I made my way to my truck and left Motiva Refinery. I've not been there once since that night, and I'll never return. Not after what happened on that drive. Port Arthur to Winnie was uneventful. This late, there were only so many drivers out on Highway 73. But I wasn't worried about 73. I was sitting in silence, no music, nothing, trying to prepare myself for what I might see on the interstate. Just like the last 2 nights, I saw nothing out of the ordinary coming out of Winnie, but I could feel my heart rate rise as I came up to that same spot the cars had been. My body was tired, my eyes ached, but I didn't even want to blink, else I'd miss something. I had the knife in my passenger seat, and my hand started to grip the handle hard. I could feel how clammy my hands were against the wood. But that 12th mile came, it went, and I saw no sign of a fire. There was nobody on the side of the road, not a thing. I'd never felt such a sense of relief, like years' worth of stress all evaporated at once. It was short-lived. A couple miles down the road, my joy was soon snuffed out. I prayed it was just a string of headlights on the other side of the road, but I quickly gave up any hope of that being true. The highway was bathed in an orange glow, brighter than ever before. It took a moment, too long for me to recognize what I was seeing was really there ahead of me, but my vision hadn't failed. Across the interstate was a line of cars, all ablaze. In front of them, shoulder to shoulder, was a string of people, all facing towards me. I slammed on my brakes, brought the truck to a halt, and made sure all my doors were locked. They didn't move an inch, but as I looked around, I realized what fate awaited me if I didn't get out of there right away. I saw several cars on the side of the road between me and the barricade. It was hard to tell, but the fire's light was bright enough to make them out. Sprawled on the ground were several bodies, lying in pools of blood. Right as the impulse to hit the gas and turn around hit me, my windows were shattered from all sides. There were others, waiting on the sides of the road, and they had surrounded me. One of them reached in and slammed my head against the wheel. This disoriented me enough for them to unlock the car and drag me out, kicking and screaming. They brought me to the barricade, my legs and feet scraping along the asphalt. Once we reached the line of people, my captors grabbed the back of my head and forced me to look up at one of their number. They broke the line and all flocked to him, the only distinguishable member among them. He had a symbol, a white M, on his hood. Another hooded man brought him a knife, kneeled to the ground and presented it to him like he was a king. He held it up in the light of the fire behind him, looked at me and said in a cold, gruff voice, "Took something that wasn't yours, didn't you?" They all began to laugh at this remark, but as he sharply raised his other hand in the air, they stopped at once. I opened my mouth to protest, met immediately with a knee to my right side and a twist of my hair. After my silence was ensured, he looked back down at me and pressed the knife against my neck. "You could have kept driving last night. You've been indifferent all your life, unfazed, unbothered. You only had to look the other way one more time. But you woke up from your stupor, you decided to be curious." He pressed the blade harder. I felt the sting of a cut, a drop of blood run down my neck. "You wanted answers. This is your answer." He pulled the knife back, raised it above his head, but just as I readied myself for the plunge, one of the others stopped him. I opened my eyes to see blue and red lights flash across his cloaked face and heard a shout from behind. "Freeze, put the knife down." The police had shown up. The masked crowd reacted immediately, rushing towards the cops en masse. Shots were fired off indiscriminately, some flying past my captors and I into the fiery barricade. There was an intense struggle right behind me that only my ears could sense. But then, I felt the grips on my arms loosen, and I saw my opportunity. I struck their knees, shook free, and rushed for the tree line on the side of the road. I hoped none of them would follow me into the fields with the cops to worry about. But after the fight on the interstate was far enough away, I could hear another set of feet running close behind. I was tired and weak. My pursuer had little trouble catching up to me. He tackled me into the grass, and in spite of any effort to break out, he flipped me over, pinning my right arm with his leg. You just had to wait as long as you could. 2 punches landed, one to the cheek, one to the nose. He put a hand on my neck, digging his finger into the cut. I thought about gutting you in the parking lot, but they don't like me making a mess there. Well, that's fine by me. Even through dazed eyes, I saw a glint of light flash across the blade as he raised it above his head. In the shine of the knife, I could see death, and all the years he would take from me if I didn't resist. Whatever strength I had, any dormant desire to keep living lunged out. I refused to die there on the side of I-10. With my one free arm, I punched up, hard as I could manage, and made the bastard bite his own teeth. The knife landed just beside my head. In one swift, impulsive motion, I grabbed the handle and shot my arm upwards before I could see what I was aiming for. It pierced his neck, right beneath the Adam's apple. I pushed him off me, got up and looked down at my attacker. All that anger, that righteous fury had gone, and life was leaving his limbs. His body twitched, his mouth sputtered, and I was looking at a man dying. I briefly wondered what he might be thinking. Was he still angry? Was he sorry he had ended up here, in a field off I-10? Or was he just a blank page with no words left? I came back to my senses shortly and remembered something he had said as he was just about to put that knife through my eye. Something he shouldn't have said, but did. I finally noticed, with just enough light reaching through the trees from the still-burning cars, this was the man with the white M on his hood. Part of me may have already guessed, but I had to know. I couldn't walk away until I knew. I lifted his hood and saw a face that I'd seen every weekday for almost 3 years. It was Frank Cotton, 42 years old, father of 2, and my manager as long as I had worked at the Motiva refinery. He was lying there, at my feet, choking on his own blood. After staring at the ruin of that man for a few more minutes, I recalled the fight I had fled from and realized how quiet it had gotten. I walked back to the highway, only to be greeted with an awful sight. If there was a winner, there was no one left to claim it, as dozens of bodies laid lifeless between the 2 shoulders of the road. I walked over them, around them, slowly making my way over to my truck. I was lucky enough to be alive, but not enough to have an easy way out of there. All 4 tires had been slashed. The cop cars were no better. Believe me, I tried. So I started walking. I walked all the way from there to Wallaceville. It took me about 5 hours. I got there around 4 a.m. The whole trek there I clutched the handle of that knife, listened for any give that I may have been followed. I was expecting I might meet one of those hooded freaks along the way. Once again, I was lucky. I found a small church, Middleton Memorial Methodist, off the feeder road, and slept in the grass near the back door. I was terrified, but I couldn't stay awake any longer. It barely felt like I had slept at all when I was woken by a pastor. He was kind enough to give me water and some food. As I got ready to explain everything, his radio already started telling the story. 37 found dead on Interstate 10 between Winnie and Anahuac. 8 were police officers. 20 of the other 29 bodies were all wearing matching uniforms. 1 was found in a field nearby. After we ate, the pastor gave me a lift to my place back in Mont Bellevue. He never asked me what happened, why I was passed out behind his church, but I don't think he needed to. That was 2 months ago, almost to the day. I work in Seabrook now, not sure I should say where. It's a shorter commute, thankfully, and I've been working on moving soon, maybe there. Maybe League City, we'll see. I don't know what Frank was really up to with those people, if they had anything to do with Motiva, and I'm never going to know. I'm not looking for answers anymore. I made it out with my skin still on and my heart still beating. That's all I can ask for. The last thing to do before I can leave this all behind me for good is tell people what really happened that night. If you're driving into Houston from the east and you find yourself on that stretch of I-10 at night, don't stop for anyone or anything. No matter what you see, it's best you don't get involved. and keep on driving. They may still be there, they may not. I'm not going to be the one to find out. I hope you never have to find out. Lastly, if anyone who still works at that refinery happens to read this, keep it to yourself. Don't ask questions. Don't let on that you've even heard of someone named Frank Cotton. You might be putting yourself in danger just by knowing this ever happened. Stay safe, stay alert, and never stop for a burning car on Interstate 10. That was nothing compared to the horrors waiting for you in the next story. A Terrible Curse on the Village of Stay Little Part 2 series. The next morning, I rose exactly like the last, hungover. I remembered the events from the night before and pushed my palm against my aching forehead in frustration. Don't piss off the barman. Why would you piss off the barman? And I lost a tenner. It wasn't the end of the world, though. I'd apologize to him and buy him a pint. That solved most issues in Stay Little. And with all hope, the kids would actually come into the surgery and weren't going to spend my money on street drugs. Not that there was a way to get street drugs in my village, as much as I sometimes wished there was. I got out of bed, lethargically dressed, and downed the pint of water I left by my bed the night before. I made crumpets, holding one in my mouth as I opened my garden gate, being careful this time to look left and right before exiting. I made the walk down to the surgery eating my breakfast, a crumpet. It tasted off. Leaves covered the ground, with few left in the trees along my walk. Once again, I pulled out my keys to open the surgery's door, but the lights were already on. I didn't do anything untoward. I just thought I was late this day. I opened the door, took off my coat to place on the communal rack, and took a routine brief look around the empty waiting room. No unwanted visitors this morning, I thought. Only my appointments. I turned to my right towards the reception and wrote my name on the sign-in sheet. Dot was sitting at her desk but hadn't said a word. "Morning, Dot," I said, not looking up from the paper. "Morning, Doctor," she said, in a much softer tone than usual, causing me to look up from the page sharply. The fact that this startled me should tell you all you need to know about her character. She was the same old Dot. Sat there with the same old mole on her face and peach-dyed gray and brittle hair, but she looked different. She looked worried. "You okay, Dot? You don't seem yourself," I said, genuinely concerned. She looked like she could burst into tears at any moment. "No, it's fine, Doctor. I'll set an appointment," she replied, unable to keep my eye contact. "Oh, then I can help. I think I have a patient in about." I checked my watch. 10 minutes, but after that I'm free. "Is that all okay?" She didn't reply. "Dot?" I repeated with inflection. "Yes, Doctor. I'll see you after," she replied with a slight waver from her otherwise flat response, at the same time using her swivel chair to turn her back to me and find something across the reception area. Her hand searched pen pots and upturned papers strewn across the unkept desk. I believe she was just pretending to look for something, and this was confirmed as I stood, waiting for her to pick something up. She didn't turn round to look at me, knowing I was still there. For Dot, this was very, very odd behavior. As much as the borderline sexual harassment kind of creeped me out, Dot was one of the old guard, a relic of the past, a dying breed. I liked her and wanted to help. "Okay, Dot. Well, I'll see you then," I said, placing the pen down on the desk as I did so. I picked up the apple with the same hand and started to walk to my office, but after a couple of steps, I turned back around. "Dot, just take it easy, okay? Just tell the patient to come right in. No more hassle needed." She didn't reply, instead nodding slightly once, before finding the pen she was supposedly looking for. Clicking it, she turned slightly and gave me a half smile over her shoulder. I smiled slightly back and nodded my head. I turned on my heel and headed to my office. Lime green walls once again greeted me as I pulled back my chair, sat on it, and pulled myself towards the desk. I booted up my computer and placed the apple on my desk. As Windows Vista greeted me on the screen, I leaned on my elbows, folding my hands together and resting the side of my face on them in order to get a good look at the clock face above the door. 9:07 a.m. My patient was late, but then again I was too that morning. I rested like this until 9:15 a.m., glazing over and watching the seconds tick by before lifting my head off my hands, motivating myself enough to get the patient's details up on my computer. I fully expected that the patient wouldn't be coming in at this point, and the normal process on this occasion was to get Dot to call the patient at home. But I decided to save her the job, as she was definitely not herself. I didn't actually know who I was scheduled to see, as I usually waited until the last minute to pull up my patient's medical records, as people canceled or just didn't turn up. Often, the details popped up on my screen and I put my head in my hands. This bloody kid. I rubbed my forehead with my thumb and index finger, leaning back in my chair. When I said, "Book an appointment next time," I didn't mean the next bloody day, I said to myself, picking up the corded landline with my free hand and continued to rub my forehead. I dialed the landline on the screen, his parents' number, and scanned his medical record as it rang. There had been a new entry input this morning by Pat, probably from our answer phone last night. One word stood out to me: holes. "This is Judy Tinsadale." I snapped back to attention and was in the process of crafting a reply before the voice continued. "I'm sorry, but I can't get to the phone right now. Please leave a message after the beep." I sighed and put the phone down. I couldn't really leave a message on his mom's answer phone if she called back and asked why I called. I didn't want to put the kid in a position where he'd have to tell his mom that he had chlamydia. Instead, I returned to my natural position of leaning back in my chair and looking up at the clock above the door. 20 minutes past 9. There was a quick knock, which caused me to straighten with a start, and the door opened hesitantly. I cleared my throat. "Come in," I said, now sitting upright, pretending to look at my screen with intensity. I heard the click-clack of someone walking in on the laminate floor before the door closed slowly with a gentle click. I fully expected it to be the boy that walked into the room, considering how meek the entrance had been, but peeling my eyes away from the nothing that was on my screen, I instead saw Dot standing in front of the doorway. "Oh, Dot, my patient hasn't arrived. I was just going to get ye," I started, stopping when Dot started unbuttoning her blouse. "Dot, Jesus Christ, what are you doing?" I stood up immediately and took a step back, covering my eyes with one hand and holding the other, palm out, in her direction. "You have to see. You have to see. I don't know what to do. I don't know." She was crying, and the words were pronounced with a painful wheeze, as if she had a lump in her throat. Without me knowing, she had moved around my extended arm, clasping two strong hands onto my other, pulling it down in a swift motion and exposing my eyes to her chest. Her bare breast sagged upon her gut, dangling towards her waist. At the center of her left breast was a cluster of open white cysts, leaking a clear liquid slowly but constantly with each heartbeat. This mass seemed to act like a nucleus for an angry red rash that covered her whole chest and breasts. Small blotches of those same white cysts speckled throughout. Her veins were pressed to the skin's surface and looked to be throbbing. "Oh my God, Dot, how long have you had this? How long have you been sitting with this?" My immediate thought was cancer, and at this stage, this looked fatal. It looked like it had spread through her bloodstream, and, even if it hadn't, large portions of her chest and both breasts would have to be removed if she didn't respond well to chemo. You could say I was almost captivated for a few seconds, but I then drew my eyes away from her chest and to her face. Poor Dot was inconsolable. Her heavily applied rouge ran down her face. A congealed mess of mucus and foundation formed under her nose and dribbled down her lips. "Please help me, please, please." She fell to her knees and hung her head, arms to her side. She was not wiping her face, and a trail of drool and mucus hung from her chin. While I was momentarily taken aback by the wound, I snapped myself out of it quickly. I was a doctor, and I had seen much worse. Or had I? This wound was different. It just wasn't anything I had seen before. It truly was awful. I knelt down opposite Dot, her face not visible when bowed. I fumbled in my pockets to find a crumpled-up napkin I had taken from the pub the night before. I reached my hand out to give it to her, but she didn't take it. I dropped it in her lap. She wasn't crying so much anymore. "This is what we're going to do, Dot. Okay?" I wasn't sure if she was listening. "Pick up the tissue if you're listening, Dot. I need to tell you what we're going to do to get you all safe and better." I continued to kneel, but her face was still not visible. After a few seconds, she reached and took the napkin from her lap with a trembling hand. She began to wipe her face slowly. I nodded in acknowledgement and continued. I'm going to call you an ambulance and get you checked out, but it'll probably be a couple of hours until it gets here. Until then, I'll get you bandaged up and we will do a few tests, okay? She wasn't responding, but I carried on anyway. I have other patients today, so you'll have to wait in Dr. Jameson's room, but we'll lay you down and you can have a rest. Like I said, Dot, only a couple of hours and we'll get you completely looked over, and then no more worry. We will know. You will know. I already knew, but my rambling seemed to comfort her. She looked up at me and smiled slightly. Her makeup was still smudged on her face, but what I fully noticed was how old Dot looked. Thanks, doll. She took my hands in hers. We stayed like that for a few seconds before I gave her palms a squeeze and stood. Now come on, this is a respectable establishment. Put that top back on. I winked and turned my back to her. She laughed dryly, so dry it was almost a cough. You perv, she replied, and I laughed too. The air felt a whole lot lighter. She put her blouse back on and I turned back around. To see a disheveled-looking Dot, but still Dot. I guided her to a chair and sat her down. Then, I took a seat and looked instinctively towards the clock. I stopped myself almost immediately, and I don't think Dot noticed. She was not wasting my time, and I didn't want her to think that she was. I refocused and picked up the landline to call the ambulance. It rang, and I was put through to the operator. I described the situation and gave the address for the surgery. We will have an ambulance dispatched shortly, said the operator placidly. Could you give me a ballpark figure on how long it'll be until it gets here, please? I replied. I shouldn't really say. I know you shouldn't say, but I'm asking you if you could. Okay. I could hear the keyboard being tapped rapidly over the phone. A few seconds passed. Oh, there seem to be a number of ambulances already heading to Stay Little. Are you sure that this hasn't already been called in? What? No, it hasn't. Okay. I could tell she doubted me. An ambulance will be with you within 3 hours. She paused. If not sooner. I ignored the dig. Thank you. I put the phone down and suppressed a sigh. 3 hours. I didn't know what to do with my hands. I went to rub my temples, but I didn't want to seem stressed in front of Dot. I forced both hands flat on the table instead and turned to Dot, straining a smile. Not long now, girl. The sound of smashing glass made me wake with a jolt. I looked around the room, but it wasn't my window, but it must have been in the same building. How long had I been out? I didn't even remember falling asleep, but checking my watch, it had only been 45 minutes. In my sleep-deprived state, I had the strangest thought that the broken glass was my next very impatient patient, hurdling whatever they could to get into the surgery and have their increasingly sore throat looked at. But this thought left almost as soon as I thought it up. Who could be that desperate? Wouldn't they just go to A&E? I looked to my right to see Dot was now led on her side on the examination table, back-facing to me. She must have become tired and done this on her own accord. I admit the padded table had been a makeshift bed for me on occasion during a long overdue lunch break. I decided not to wake her. Instead, I stood to investigate the noise outside. I reached down to take the apple from my desk. Rotten. It was rotten. Maggots crawled through the decayed mass that lay almost flat on my desk. It looked as if it had been there for weeks. I frantically pulled out my mobile phone to check the date, but it was the same day as before I had fallen asleep. I felt almost relieved until I noticed the dozens of missed calls I had received, which instantly gave me a cold sweat. What the fuck is going on? I said to myself as I opened my phone and dialed 121 to listen to the first of the voice messages, opening the door out of my office and into the hallway, walking down to the reception and where I believed the smashing sound had come from. I was immediately aware of the sound of what sounded like a riot outside of the main entrance. The plants in the hallway were dead and rotten. 17 new messages. Message 1. My phone said to me as I entered the reception area. Shards of glass covered the floor as dozens of people banged at the door, at the windows, at the walls themselves, attempting to get inside. When they saw me, a collective scream tore through the crowd, one of relief, pain, anger, and fear. Screams of, "Help me, help us," or anything else. The sound immediately made me piss myself in fear. Throwing up maggots was the last thing I heard from my phone before I dropped it on the ground. rushing to the front door to unlock it. As I attempted to do so, I looked up to the figure behind the green door. The little window in the middle, completely smashed through, allowing me a clear view of the barman from last night. Except his eye was gone, replaced with dozens of maggots that swarmed around the empty socket, chewing through the flesh of his face, some deciding that the used-up flesh of his eye was no longer appetizing, and deciding to burrow new holes around his entire face. He stopped banging the door and screaming for just a second, frantically taking both hands to claw at the clumps of larvae that filled his face. Almost as if he was demonstrating how futile this act was, he pressed his face through the window in the door, so he was less than an inch from mine. Teeth in a clenched grimace, and his remaining eye bloodshot and opening almost unnaturally large. I had a clear view of his eye socket that had been chewed down to the bone, the handfuls that he had removed already being replaced by the ones eating away at his brain, crawling back through the cavern left by his eradicated eyeball and into the artificial light of the surgery reception. With what looked like extreme effort, he unclenched his jaw and opened his mouth laboriously, as if his jaw weighed tons, spilling maggots from his mouth in the process, many falling onto my chest, trousers, and shoes. Maggots swarmed his gums and tongue. You may judge me for what I did next, but I know that God will judge me, and with each word I write and each day I live, I make myself accountable. I took a step back. I stepped away from the door. I did not unlock it. I instead looked around at each of the faces pressed at each of the windows, the bodies pushing at each other, people attempting to climb through windows far too small for them, breaking and dislocating bones in the process, ripping large cuts through the soft skin of their bellies along the broken glass of the window frames. Each of these people covered in maggots. All the patients that had turned up with rashes in the last few days had these innocuous patches replaced by writhing swarms of flesh-eating larvae. I understand that I could not have helped them all, that I would have likely been ripped apart by a horde driven crazy by pain, but at least I could have tried. But instead, I took another step back, and another. As the faces screamed louder, the screams rose from anguish to terrific anger. Anger at me for daring to leave them as I turned tail and ran. I was not thinking clearly. I was terrified. I ran from the people that needed my help the most to my office, locking the door behind me. I faced the door and took a step back, unsure how to process what I had just seen. The general crashing continued before a loud boom notified me that the door had been broken down, torn completely from its hinges. I heard the sound of dozens of footsteps with accompanying screams racing through the reception and hallway to my office door, where fists, feet, and bodies were flung at it, attempting to break it down. I threw myself against the door, attempting to brace it from the front, before turning my back to the door and bracing it from behind. Which is when I saw him. Joe, please help me. He must have climbed through the now open window leading into my office. He stood in the middle of the room, Dot led motionless on the table next to him. She did not seem to have moved. He looked relatively normal, clothed in jeans and a plain t-shirt, but with eyes bloodshot wide with horror and tear-stained cheeks. Please, please, please. He kept repeating this phrase as he undid his belt methodically and went to drop his jeans. I could not draw my eyes away, although I knew what to expect. His jeans fell down to his ankles, and where his genitals previously were was a writhing mass of larvae, spreading also to his stomach and upper thighs. Please, please, please. He moved closer to me, arms outstretched. He hugged me, maggots falling from his crotch onto my jeans. I was paralyzed and felt like I could pass out at any second. Please, please. He dropped to the floor in a heap, and the roaring sound from the other side of the door was replaced by a succession of thuds over the space of several seconds as my patients all collapsed as Joe had done. The silence was deafening. I waited several seconds before slumping to the floor, back to the wall and knees to my chest. I couldn't stop shaking. I focused on my senses, the smooth fabric of my trousers, the stench of my own piss mixed with the sickly smell of rot from the apple, an ambulance wailing in the distance, mixed with the collective gorging of the maggots on Joe's corpse, my knees directly in front of my face, blocking my vision. I didn't look at the boy as I unclasped my right hand from my knee and made its way to Joe's neck. I checked for a pulse but could not find one, only the occasional maggot thrashing under his skin. I leaned back against the wall and placed my hands on the ground on either side of me, only to recoil them immediately after finding I'd placed them directly into a swarm of maggots. I stood quickly, wiping maggots off my hands and body frantically, only now remembering fully what sort of situation I found myself in. I moved over to Dot to check her pulse, moving her body on her back. Her chest and face were cavernous holes, but the maggots no longer feasting upon her, but seemingly leaving her body. I believe I threw up at this point. I cannot continue for now. This recounting is making me feel sick. I will finish the story of my time at Stay Little tomorrow. Think you're ready for more? The next story will test your nerves like never before. I'm Jack, and he's Will. And we spent our whole lives together. We were living out our truck, scrapping, scavenging, until we got word of an abandoned mine in the hills of the Salem Plateau. There's a lot of good loot in those old mines, so we set out, just the two of us, to make our living. We weren't supposed to be there. The old mine had been closed for years, abandoned after a collapse took out most of the workers, and the locals said it was cursed. That didn't stop us, though. We figured it was far enough from anyone who'd care, and besides, we liked the quiet and the solitude. Will and I had been running from the world for a long time, just the two of us. He'd always been the brave one, the one with the crazy ideas that got us into trouble. But I never minded following him. It's not like we had anyone else. You hear that? Will whispered, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of the woods. I paused, holding my breath. At first, all I could hear was the rustle of the trees swaying in the wind, but then I caught it. A faint, pained whimper coming from deeper in the woods. It didn't sound human. Yeah, I murmured, glancing at Will. You think it's an animal? Only one way to find out, he said with that reckless grin of his, already turning toward the sound. Will, I warned, though I knew he wasn't going to stop. We weren't supposed to be out here in the first place, and messing around with a wounded animal was just asking for trouble. But when had that ever stopped us? He gave me that look, the one that said, "Come on, man. Don't leave me hanging." And, like always, I sighed and followed. We left the old mine entrance behind us, making our way through the underbrush toward the clearing. The trees were thick, and the setting sun made it harder to see. Every step felt heavier, the weight of the forest pressing in on us. The sound grew louder as we got closer, that strange, low whimper that tugged at something deep inside me. When we finally broke through to the clearing, we found it. At first, it didn't look like much, just a small, dark shape lying near a cluster of rocks. But as we got closer, I realized it wasn't just any animal. It was a cub, or at least something that looked like one, though I couldn't quite place what it was. Its fur was black, almost oily, and its eyes, damn, I can still see those eyes, glowed faintly red like embers in a dying fire. It was small, shaking from whatever had ripped into it, bleeding out onto the dirt. Jesus, Will muttered, crouching down beside it. What the hell is it? I asked, feeling a chill creep up my spine. I don't know, he said, reaching out to touch it. But it's hurt bad, we can't just leave it here. He was right. As much as I didn't want to admit it, something about the creature, something about the sound it made, hit me in a way I couldn't shake. I knew we should have left it. We should have walked away and pretended we never saw it. But I couldn't. Neither of us could. Will carefully lifted the creature into his arms. We'll take it back, he said, his voice softer than usual. Get a closer look. I nodded, even though every instinct in me screamed to leave it behind. The air felt different now, heavier, like the forest itself was watching us. But we didn't say anything. Will took the lead, and I followed, our steps quicker now, like we both wanted to get out of the woods as fast as possible. As we made our way back toward the truck, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting something to leap out at us. The sound of the wind through the trees started to feel more like whispers, low and sinister. By the time we reached the truck, it was almost dark, and I could feel that tension in the air again. I opened the passenger door, and Will gently set the cub down on the seat. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine groaned but didn't start. "What's wrong?" Will asked, but I could hear the strain in his voice. He was starting to feel it too. "I don't know," I muttered, trying again. Still nothing. "Pop the hood," he said, already climbing out. I did as he asked, but I had a bad feeling in my gut. When Will bent down to check underneath, I saw his whole body stiffen. A second later, he stood up, shaking his head, his face pale. "The fuel line's torn." I stared at him, my heart sinking. "What? How?" Will didn't answer. He didn't have to. We both knew something had been out there with us, something that didn't want us to leave. And now we were stuck. The truck was dead. I stood by the passenger door, watching as Will lay on his back under the truck, working on the fuel line with a roll of Gorilla duct tape. The line had been slashed, clean, like someone had sliced through it with a knife. But that didn't make sense. There wasn't anyone else out here, right? "Just give me a minute," Will grunted from under the truck. "I can patch this." I kept glancing back at the woods. That feeling of being watched, it was still there, pressing in on us like the trees were alive. We weren't supposed to be out here in the first place, and now with the sun almost gone, it felt like we were trespassing on something we shouldn't have messed with. The creature in the back seat whimpered again, that strange, unsettling sound that made my skin crawl. I shot a glance at it. Still alive, still shaking, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. We hadn't been able to figure out what it was. All we knew was that it was hurt, and it wasn't going to last much longer. "Maybe we should have left it," I said, mostly to myself. I didn't really mean it. Not completely. Will's voice came from under the truck, muffled but sharp. We couldn't just leave it there. What if something else had gotten to it? I swallowed, my throat dry. Yeah, what if? As he worked, my mind wandered back to the old stories. The locals around the Salem Plateau didn't talk much about the mine, but every now and then, when we'd head into town for supplies, we'd catch snippets of conversation about it. They always mentioned the same thing, the Ozark Howler. I never put much stock in the stories. People said it was a giant black creature, somewhere between a wolf and a mountain lion, but no one ever got a good look at it. Some called it the Howler because they claimed it could mimic sounds, animal cries, human voices, luring people deeper into the woods. Others said it was just a ghost story, something to keep kids from wandering too far. But standing there in the dark, the whispers of those rumors clawed at the back of my mind. "Will," I whispered, "you remember what they used to say about this place?" He stopped for a moment, not turning to face me, but I could tell he knew exactly what I was talking about. He nodded, just a small motion. "The Howler," I continued. "They say it's real." "Just stories," he said, though his voice didn't sound so sure. "They tell them to keep idiots like us from wandering off. They say it lives out here," I pressed, "in the shadows." Will poked himself out from under the truck, wiping his hands on his shirt. He looked at me. "You hear yourself?" But I could hear it in his voice, the doubt, the fear. That's when I heard it again, a rustle in the trees, faint but unmistakable. I froze, straining to listen. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then came that sound. The howl. Deep, low, almost vibrating through the air. Will slid the rest of the way out from under the truck, his face slick with sweat, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," I muttered, scanning the tree line. I heard it. It was closer this time, much closer. "What do you think it is?" I asked, my voice a little too loud in the stillness. Will didn't answer right away. He stood, wiping his hands on his jeans before tossing the roll of tape into the truck bed. His eyes drifted toward the woods, that uneasy look creeping over his face again. "I don't know, man, but we need to get out of here. Whatever that thing is, I don't think it's friendly." I glanced at the cub in the back seat, shivering and whimpering. "You think it's after the cub? Like it's trying to finish it off?" Will's mouth tightened, and he nodded slowly. "Yeah, maybe. It could be something territorial. Predators don't usually leave injured prey alive." The air grew even heavier, the shadows in the trees seeming to stretch and move. That howl, it wasn't just some wild animal. It had a rhythm to it, a purpose. It wasn't hunting, it was closing in. What if that's what hurt the cub in the first place? I asked, panic rising in my chest. What if it's coming to finish the job? Will gave me a grim look. Then we better hope this patch holds. I could hear the unspoken question in his voice. What if it didn't hold? What if we couldn't get the trick running in time? I didn't have an answer for that. Just then, another howl pierced the air. This one so close that it felt like it was right behind us. The trees seemed to shift, shadows rippling through the woods as something massive moved between them. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness, but all I could see were the outlines of trees. Until they weren't just trees anymore. Something was out there, moving. I could feel it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as a large hulking shape stepped out of the shadows, just for a moment before disappearing again. Will saw it too. "Get in the truck," he shouted. I didn't need to be told twice. I threw open the passenger door and jumped inside, my heart racing as Will slid back under the truck, finishing up the patch. The cub whined again, louder this time, and I couldn't help but look at it. Its eyes glowed brighter in the darkness, almost like it was scared of what was coming. Will scrambled into the driver's seat, jamming the key into the ignition. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, twisting the key. The engine sputtered once, twice, but wouldn't start. "Come on!" Another howl, this one practically on top of us. The creature wasn't hiding anymore. It was out there, in the clearing, watching us. I didn't know what it wanted, but that look in its eyes, those glowing red orbs that seemed to cut through the night, it wasn't just hunting. It was after something. The truck engine roared to life, and I felt a moment of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. The sound of something crashing through the underbrush set my pulse racing again. "Go," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. Will didn't need to be told. He slammed his foot on the gas, and the truck lurched forward, tearing down the trail. But as we sped through the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't done with us yet. The shadows seemed to stretch toward the truck, and just when I thought we were in the clear, I saw it. A hulking shape, just out of the corner of my eye, running alongside us, keeping pace. I didn't get a good look, but it was big, bigger than anything I'd ever seen in the woods, and fast. Will's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "What the hell is that thing?" "I don't know," I muttered, staring out the window, my heart pounding. "But it's after us." And then it hit me, the cub. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't after us. It was after it. But I didn't say anything. Not yet. There wasn't time to figure it out. All I could do was pray that we'd make it out alive. We couldn't keep running. The engine had stalled again, and the truck was coasting on what little momentum we had left. The cub, or whatever it was, had stopped moving. Will and I exchanged a look. It was over. There was no way we could outrun that thing. Not now. We stumbled out of the truck, standing in the clearing, both of us breathing hard. The shadows around us pulsed, moving as if alive, and I knew it was here. The howler. "I think it's done for," Will said, his voice quiet and broken. He glanced at the cub in the back seat, its tiny chest no longer rising, its glowing eyes dull now in death. For all we knew, it had died miles back, and we'd just been driving a corpse through the night. I stared at the trees, my heart thundering in my chest. What do we do now? My voice cracked, the weight of everything crashing down on me. Will was silent, his face pale in the moonlight. He slowly opened the truck door, reached into the back seat, and gently picked up the lifeless body of the cub. It looked a hell of a lot lighter than I expected, barely a burden in his arms. "We give it back," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't ask if he was sure. I knew we had no choice. We couldn't escape, and whatever was out there, it wanted the cub. We hoped. Will started walking toward the tree line, and I followed, my heart pounding in my ears. The woods were deathly quiet now, not a single sound but the crunch of our boots on the dry earth. The air was thick with tension, like the whole forest was holding its breath. And then we saw it, just beyond the shadows, waiting. The Ozark howler stepped into the clearing, its massive form towering over us, eyes glowing that terrible red. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, muscles rippling beneath its skin. It looked like a predator. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. But I couldn't move. The only thing I could do was stand there, frozen, as Will approached it with the cub in his arms. I could see it in the creature's eyes, the pain, the loss. It knew. It had been chasing us not out of malice, but out of grief. The cub wasn't prey. It was its offspring. We had taken it, unknowingly, and now it had come for what was left. Will knelt down slowly, his hands trembling as he laid the cub on the ground before the beast. He backed away, his eyes never leaving the howler's face, and for a long moment, nothing happened. The howler stood over its cub, silent, its breath heavy in the stillness. The anger in its eyes faded, replaced by something deeper. It let out a soft, mournful sound, something like a whimper, and bowed its head. I felt my chest tighten, a lump rising in my throat. We'd been so scared, so sure it was hunting us. But now, seeing the creature mourn, it was clear we were wrong. It wasn't a monster. It was a parent. I reached for Will's hand, squeezing it gently. "Let's go," I whispered, though the words felt too small for the moment. We moved quietly back to the truck, our steps slow and careful. The howler didn't stop us. It watched us go, its red eyes glowing softly in the darkness, but there was no hostility in them now. Only sadness. Will climbed into the driver's seat and I slid in next to him. The truck, patched up and barely holding together, was ready to roll down the mountain. Will put it in neutral, and we started down the slope, coasting quietly. No one said a word. As we descended, I looked out the back window. The howler stood at the edge of the clearing, watching us go, its massive form silhouetted against the night sky. It didn't move. It didn't follow. We made it down the first hill, the truck rolling slowly, the headlights barely cutting through the dark. The further we went, the more distant the howler became, but the weight of its presence lingered, a reminder of what we had faced. It let us leave. The silence in the cab was heavy, neither of us daring to break it as we coasted down the treacherous slopes. The trees seemed to close in around us, the road winding and steep, but for the first time all night, I didn't feel like we were being chased. It was over. We had survived. But as the howler faded from sight, I knew we wouldn't forget it. Its mournful cry, its grief. It would stay with us, haunting the edges of our memory. And deep in the Salem Plateau, the Ozark howler remained, a creature of legend, watching over its lost cub, as silent and powerful as the night itself. You might want to catch your breath, because the next story will leave you speechless. A jaunty Caribbean tune. One morning in early spring, I was lazing in bed swiping on my phone. I wish I could say this was not my habit and that usually at this time I'd be stepping out of a cold shower after working out in the gym downstairs. But that would be a complete lie, so I won't say it. At least I didn't usually sleep past 9 anymore. I was watching a fresh episode of Good Mythical Morning on YouTube. I forget what Rhett and Link were doing, but probably eating something strange. Most of the episodes weren't as innovative as they used to be, but it was comforting to watch, like hanging out with old friends you always have the same conversations with. Mid-bit, an unfamiliar jingle started playing over their brotherly ribbing. It seemed like an odd editorial choice, and the two comedians didn't acknowledge it. I paused the video and realized that the song must be coming from some other program on my phone. Was I getting a call on some messaging app I barely used? Nothing was popping up on my screen, and I didn't have any new notifications. It stopped after only a few bars. I resumed the video. A few minutes later, though, the same damn song. Again, no notifications, no calls, just this quiet, simple, mysterious jingle. I had never heard this thing before that morning, and I didn't think I'd installed any new apps recently. I listened carefully this time. It played 4 bars in total before going silent again. It happened again an hour later as I was making a smoothie. This time, it just started playing from my pocket. All right, time to get to the bottom of this, I thought. I worked from home and didn't have strict hours, and I was admittedly always open to excuses to procrastinate. I Googled, my phone is playing a random jingle for no reason, and tapped the most promising link. It opened a Google Help thread for the Pixel phone, what I have. Phone plays random alert song, no record in notifications. Trying to figure out why my phone randomly plays a notification song that isn't in the library of alarms, and when there is no alarm set, and no notification, and no activity on the phone. Twice now, several weeks apart, not necessarily at the same time each occasion, and most recently at 5:23 p.m. today, my phone randomly and loudly started playing what sounds like an alarm sound/song. A repeating musical tone, dum dum da 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 da, dum dum da da da, dum dum da da da. It goes on for about a minute and then stops. Nothing is happening, no notifications appear. The notification record shows only things like maps updates on traffic, and I have no alarms set. Totally puzzled and lost. I'm not technology illiterate, but this mysterious and unexplainable behavior is annoying and worrisome. I tried to match the written sounds to the ones I'd been hearing, but it struck me how pretty much any melody at all could be mentally imposed upon a bunch of dum-dums and das in written form. There was a back and forth between sympathetic online do-gooders for a while, before the OP posted again. Also, I found one obscure post in a pixel group in Reddit referring to what I am sure is precisely the same phenomena, though he termed it "Pixel plays a random jaunty Caribbean tune," which is exactly what it is. The post was over a year old, however, and seemed to be for an original Pixel or Pixel 2. No response yet to my pleas for information on whether he ever figured it out. At first I thought I was onto something here. My own troublesome tune could be called jaunty and Caribbean? Maybe. Though it was also strangely melancholic. And it wasn't loud. It was soft enough, in fact, that it could take several seconds to really notice consciously once it started playing. My hopes were dashed when I scrolled down and listened to the video he uploaded. Definitely not the same. And he eventually figured out that it was caused by an app I had never heard of nor installed. In 20 minutes of searching, a pretty large amount in Googling time and the most I could justify during a workday, that was the most promising lead. I mostly forgot about it until I was in the shower late that night. At first, I thought it was just my subconscious mind chewing over the notes, looking for meaning in an unsolved mystery. But when I shut the water off and stuck my head out the curtain, I realized it was actually playing from where I'd left my phone on the counter. In a split-second decision, I jumped out to try to record it somehow. That would be tough, as I didn't have anything to record with except my phone itself. But I keep a voice recorder app on my home screen just for such spontaneous recording occasions. However, even though I had wiped my hands on my towel on the way over, my finger was still too damp to properly register on the fingerprint scanner. By the time I entered my passcode, the 4 bars of song were already finished. All I was left with was a puddle of water to clean off the floor. That night, the song played in my dreams, but it was probably more than just my dream engine recycling the day's stimuli. As I mentioned before, I sleep with my phone on my nightstand. It had most likely been piping the song directly into my sleeping brain more than once that night. While the notes were still fresh in my memory, I decided, since I hadn't been able to record it, perhaps I could reproduce it. I sat down at the electric piano in the other room, pausing only to wipe the sleep out of my eyes, then started to play. After several minutes, I was experiencing a rising sense of unease. This was a simple tune. I should have it by now. As a hobbyist musician, I would often sit at my piano, reproducing melodies by ear from pop songs I had heard. Just for fun. I thought I was pretty good at it. But the more I tried to capture this stupid simple tune, the slipperier it seemed to become. Even once I was pretty sure I had gotten all the elements right, it still sounded completely wrong. It was when I took an art class and tried to draw portraits. I would pay meticulous attention to minute details, proportions, and spacing of the facial features of the person I was trying to draw. But when I took a step back and just looked at what I had created, it wouldn't look at all like that person. After another 10 minutes of tinkering, I realized that the notes I had chosen weren't actually quite right. I began to think that the real notes were all actually flatter or sharper than any of the 88 tones my keyboard could produce. Did it originate from a country where they used different musical scales or microtones? Unfortunately, all that was beyond my hobbyist knowledge, and my fingers slid off the keys in defeat. Later that week, I was out at Victoria Bar, having dinner with friends. We were laughing and having a good time when I realized that the hair on my arms was standing up. I did a mental inventory of what my senses were telling me. This took me longer than usual, given the mango margaritas in my system. The place was rowdy with a 20s and 30s crowd as usual. I remember this one lady there had a really shrill, unrestrained laugh, the kind that made people look around to see what could possibly be that fucking funny. She was laughing at that moment, and I had to wait for it to die down before I realized what had given me goosebumps. I whipped my phone out and hushed my friends. "Listen," I said urgently, holding my phone out over the tater tots at the center of the table. The song ended only a couple of seconds later. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked. Confused looks and shaking heads. Damn. I let my head and shoulders slump dramatically toward the scraps of my dinner waffle. Too loud in here. I set out to tell them the tale so far, waving my hands and widening my eyes at appropriate moments to emphasize how spooky it all was. They were properly intrigued, and none of them had heard of anything like it before. "What day did it start?" Samara asked. She had very expressive eyebrows that I had admired ever since we met in a college biology course, and her right one was raised quizzically now. I envied her ability to utilize either eyebrow for this, as I was only capable of raising my left. Trying to do so with the righty would only result in a look of constipation and, if I persisted long enough, an aching in my eyeballs. I was always amused by the fact that if I took too long to answer her question, she would switch which eyebrow was asking, simultaneously cocking her head and widening her eyes a bit to communicate that I was being too slow for her liking. She did so now. Friday? Yeah, Friday," I replied. "Friday," she repeated, looking at me meaningfully. I blinked at her slowly. "Yees. Friday," I said again, wondering which of us was being dumb. I had a sinking feeling it was probably me. Samara sighed and looked around. "Can anyone who left their apartment on Friday tell him what was special about that day?" Vicente chimed in. He was probably the friend I was closest with there. Ever since we had spent 2 miserable and sometimes amazing summers together fighting wildfires for money, we had shared a bond that can only be formed by long hours of shared suffering. I was driving for Uber Eats and someone ordered a jalapeno and olive sandwich. That doesn't usually happen. Samara snapped her fingers and pointed at him. Exactly. I tried to use my brain. But once again, the margaritas were getting in the way. I raised my hands in exasperation, waiting for someone to spoon-feed me the answer. "April 1st, Samara said at the same time Vicente said. "April Fool's Day." "Oh. Whoa. Yeah, you're right. You think someone is playing a joke on me? And aren't April Fool's jokes supposed to end after April 1st? Did anyone have access to your phone soon before it started?" Rob, Samara's boyfriend. He was currently sporting a very Portland mustache with the tips waxed up into playful points. Combined with the interrogative, it made me feel like Hercule Poirot was questioning me about a case. Rob was an actor, not a professional one, though maybe he wanted to be. And the way he carried himself and spoke always made me feel like he was putting on a show that he'd rehearsed. I was never quite able to decide if I liked him or not. But he'd asked a good question. I made stalling noises as I looked up at the ceiling and tried to remember anything at all about March 31st. It wasn't that long ago. Seems like I'd be able to remember something about that day. But when you have the same basic routine, most days tended to blend together. "Wait, let me take a look here," I said, pulling up the calendar on my phone for some tidbit that would jumpstart my memory. While I looked, the others bandied hypotheses on other causes. Half listening, it seemed like malware, an errant app, or a prank seemed like the most popular guesses. I informed my friends of my lack of human contact the day before the tune had started playing, and the mystery remained unsolved. Vicente and I had an ultimate Frisbee League game the next night. I'd played the sport off and on since college, and had gotten Vicente into it. I remember it was a tight game, but we had ultimately pulled ahead, so our spirits were high as I gave Vicente a ride home. As we laughed about our times fighting fires together, I noticed Google Maps trying to direct me along a strange turn. I knew how to get back to Vicente's place. I was just in the habit of using Google Maps, so I'd have a heads up about traffic. I pinched at the map to zoom out and see the bigger picture, but for the zoom function wouldn't work. "Hey, do you think we should take this turn it's telling us to take?" I asked. Vicente didn't give it more than a second before replying, "No way, just go the way we always do." I shut off my phone screen and stuck to our usual route. I kept expecting to hit some traffic that would explain the route change, but it never came. I would have forgotten about this incident had it not happened 3 more times that week. Each time I would get suspicious when a turn seemed strange and unfamiliar. I would try to zoom out to see what was going on, but the map wouldn't zoom. Then I would just shut it down and continue on the way I knew. Just before the last time, my maps tried to lead me into the unknown. I was hiking with Vicente up one of Portland's forested buttes. Our hiking cadence is a bit unusual. It consists of one of us running up ahead or clambering up a boulder, then throwing a frisbee back and forth a couple of times, aiming right at the other guy's heart. It's a success if he doesn't have to move his feet to catch it. If he does have to move and doesn't actually catch it, it's up to you to run over and grab the disc. You must be punished for your inaccuracy. Vicente popped out from behind a tree 15 yards ahead of me and flicked the disc through the air. It was a little high, but I was able to stretch up and snatch it without jumping. "Hey," I said, "do you feel like a man?" "Hey, my throw wasn't that bad," he retorted. "No," I laughed. "I'm serious. When did you feel like you stopped being a boy and started being a man? Sometimes I feel like a man, but other times I'm not sure. I'm not a father or a husband. I haven't been to war. I don't know how to build a house. I didn't go out into the desert for 3 days alone and return a man. My favorite thing to do is play with frisbees, which are toys, you know?" Maybe you're right," Vicente says. "You're 27, right? If we were living in prehistory, you'd be a grandfather by now." "Right. Instead, I'm a wage slave, working a job I don't care about to pay off student loans for an education I don't use and don't think I needed." "At least you have a steady job," he said. "Food delivery sucks, man. I barely make enough to keep up my car and stay off the street. I'd make more if I was driving people, but my car is too old. All that's gonna change when your music hits critical mass, bro, no doubt." "Heads!" I yelled and threw the disc at his back. He spun and clapped his hands together, trapping the disc between them. "Nice one." I wasn't just saying that. I thought Vicente was really skilled at making electronic music. It was all wizardry to me, but I could tell that his beats were something special. I wish I had something like that, something that could actually get me places in the modern world. Well, I don't know what makes a man, but I sure know I'll feel like one when I make my first million doing what I love. He said. Vicente threw the disc forward at a sharp angle up and to the right. It reached toward the sky and then dipped down backwards, right into my hands. Perfect. Vicente and I had a lot of conversations like this. He had been my co-pilot when we were firefighters. That makes it sound like I was a pilot, but I was just driving a van full of dirty men and tools. I got paid more for being behind the wheel, but it meant less sleep. Before and after a shift, when most were snoozing in the back to make up the deficit, I had to stay alert and get us to the fire or to camp. And when driving hundreds of miles between fires, sometimes I'd have to stay up most of the night driving and then work a full shift the next day, catching a few minutes of rest here and there in the dirt or against a tree when it was safe. I did like the extra $50 per day, but I also really liked sleep, and still do. Vicente, though, he almost always stayed awake with me, chatting, joking, choosing the music. He didn't get paid any extra, aside from enjoying the most comfortable seat, but he never complained about it. We had a lot of time for deep discussion up there, and there were few topics we didn't touch. I clapped him on the shoulder as we stopped to appreciate a view of the city. "Thanks for being a good friend, Vicente." An hour later, I'm driving Vicente home when I say to him, "It's happening again." We were stopped at a red light when I noticed my map taking us once again in the wrong direction. I confirmed it by trying to zoom and scroll the map unsuccessfully. "What do you mean?" he asked. "The map thing. My phone is trying to take me somewhere, not your apartment." The driver behind us honked, and I realized that the light was green. I turned left, as my map wanted me to, then promptly pulled over into a convenience store parking lot. "Look, try to scroll around and see where it's taking us," I said, handing Vicente my phone. "The same thing happened the other day, remember? We just ignored it and went to your place. But this has happened a few more times since then." "Huh?" Vicente grunted, fiddling with the map for a moment. He gazed at a discarded soda cup by the curb, then fixed me with a bright-eyed grin. "So let's check it out. Who knows, maybe it's like a secret Portland medallion." "A what?" I asked. "The Portland medallion. Every year, a medallion is hidden somewhere in Portland, and they give clues to lead people to it. Only one person can win. I think they get a few $1,000s." I've lived here most of my life. How have I never heard of this before? Just not paying attention, I guess. I rolled my eyes. All right, fuck it. Let's go find out what the hell is going on. I pulled the car back into the flow of traffic and headed west toward the setting sun. I couldn't see our final destination, but the estimated time of arrival was counting down minute by minute. A sense of expectation and eagerness was growing within me. Now that I was on this path, I was excited to find where it led. I kept glancing at the estimated arrival time to ensure I was making good time. I felt an anxiety that I would miss something important if I didn't keep up with the estimate. And there was another feeling that underpinned everything else. Do you ever get a sense of déjà vu? I asked Vicente. I feel like we've done this before. Maybe I dreamed about it and only partly remember. Vicente looked at me blankly. Spooky. Then he grinned. Yeah, I sensed the approach of something familiar yet unknown. It seemed as though if I just thought long and hard enough, I would remember what was coming, despite knowing that was impossible. We passed through downtown and kept on until an expanse of trees stretched out to either side before us. Forest Park, the largest city park in the world. I'd been there probably a dozen times and explored some of the trails, which were usually populated by joggers, hikers, and dog walkers. There were large stretches of the park that you wouldn't see from any trail, however. Soon, we reached a point where the course laid out for us veered into the park, but there was no road or even a visible walking path. I parallel parked, and for once, I was able to do so with no extra back and forth. The sun was setting now, casting a strange light over everything. I looked over at Vicente. It seemed like an ideal spooky time for the song to start playing, but it didn't. I guess it's a hike from here? In for a penny, in for a pound? I hoped I was using that saying right. I took a headlamp from my glove box and gave it to Vicente. In answer, he took it and got out of the car. I grabbed my pack and followed. Vicente and I spent a few minutes looking for a path near where the map said to enter, but there was nothing but forested hill. Fortunately, we were already dressed for a hike and wearing long pants, so we forged the best path we could through the underbrush. We didn't follow the course set out by the map exactly, choosing instead to take the avenues of least resistance. In my experience, Forest Park never really got dark. The lights of the surrounding city lent it a persistent ethereal glow. But for some reason this night was different. And soon the dense canopy and failing daylight prompted us to use our lights, Vicente with my headlamp and me just with the flash on my phone. The sounds of the city faded as well, replaced by the hoots of barred owls, a gusty breeze moving through the foliage, coiled tree trunks squeaking and creaking as they rubbed against one another, and for a few minutes, the yipping cries of a coyote pack. Fortunately, those came from south of us, not east where we were headed. Vicente and I were largely silent, but for consultations about which route through the brush to take. Whenever he swung his head back to talk, he'd end up blinding me, so I told him not to look back. Just keep his light pointed forward, and I'd tell him which direction to go. A light rain began to patter onto the leaves above us. When my phone showed that we were just a few minutes away, I put my hand on Vicente's shoulder to stop him. "We're close," I said in a low voice. "Turn off your light for a minute." He did, and I wrapped my hand around my own light, allowing my eyes to adjust to the darkness. I consciously slowed my breathing and strained my senses to see if I could detect anything notable. A light in the distance, voices, anything. It was raining more heavily now, however. The white noise was like a blanket over our heads, muffling any other sounds. Water dripped down my back and plastered my hair to my forehead. "What are we waiting for?" Vicente asked. "I just wanted." I began to answer him, but that damned song began playing and I dropped my phone in startlement. It landed with the light shining upward into my face, so after I grabbed it I was again blinded for several moments. "Dude, shut that thing off," Vicente said. "I think I hear something." I tried reducing the volume, but it had no effect. I didn't want to turn the phone off and lose my light, so I squeezed where I knew the speaker outlets were to quiet it as much as I could and listened again, frozen. At first, I didn't hear what Vicente was talking about. All I heard was the patter of rain, our own breathing, and the song. The song. It was echoing strangely. We looked at each other as the song played to its finish, but the echo continued for another 2 bars. No, not an echo. It was coming from somewhere else around us as well as from my phone. Goosebumps prickled across my body as we confirmed with each other what we both just thought we heard. Vicente ventured, "Hello," and I hissed at him to be quiet as fear got the best of me. A female voice called, "Who's there?" and we both jumped. "Shit," I croaked. Vicente broadcast our names and asked for hers. A light clicked on, some brush rustled, and a figure emerged. She was a bit taller and wider than me, with the whites of her eyes clearly visible all the way around. She seemed out of place in the woods, wearing dark tights under a peach-colored dress and green coat. "I'm Martina. You heard the song too?" she asked, shifting her weight from foot to foot. "Yeah," I responded. "Well, it's been playing on my phone, but we both heard it and followed the map out here. Do you know what it is?" Martina shook her head, her dark, wet curls swaying under her knit cap. "I was just on the way home from dinner, and my maps started leading me out here. It wasn't that far, so I decided to check it out this time. Whatever it is has been trying to get me out here all week. I shouldn't even be out here by myself. I don't know what I was thinking. I didn't think it'd be so deep in here, you know? Anyway, I'm rambling. My grandma says I do that when I'm nervous. Have you two found anything?" I was a little taken aback by how chatty she was right from the beginning. She reminded me of a cousin of mine in that way. "Just you," Vicente said. I was about to say something when another voice called out from behind us. "You all here 'cause of the song, right?" I yelled and nearly jumped out of my skin as I swept my light around, and the others weren't much better composed. This fourth person, at least, seemed prepared for a hike. He wore military-style boots and pack, with cargo pants and a hooded raincoat. A light attached to his backpack strap pointed downward, washing the brush at his feet in white light. "Okay?" Vicente called out to the woods in exasperation. "Is there anyone else in the woods who'd like to come out and say hello?" No other volunteers came forward. I introduced us to the newcomer and asked his name. "Aaron," he said simply. "Well, to answer your question, Aaron, yes, we're here because of the song," I said. "Do you know what it is?" Aaron took a bottle from his pack, taking his time to twist off the cap and enjoy a swallow. "It's a game," he finally said. "That's the only answer makes sense to me. Games have a winner. I'm going to be that winner, and I'm counting on a prize." He looked us up and down critically. "You all can follow me, but only if you're okay with second place." Martina spoke up. "And what if it's something else? Something dangerous?" Aaron lifted up the side of his raincoat, revealing a pistol holstered at his hip, open carry style. "If someone comes at me with something other than a prize, then I can handle that too." It didn't sound like a boast, just a statement of fact. My stomach turned a bit at the sight of the firearm. I wasn't sure if Aaron meant it as a threat or a reassurance, but the mere sight of it seemed to raise the stakes of what we were all doing out here. "Keep going or not, it's your choice," Aaron said. "I'm going. I don't mind if you follow me, but I won't wait for you." With that, he turned and began hiking up the slope ahead of us. The three of us looked at each other. Vicente shrugged. "We've come this far, right?" Despite the anxiety dancing in my stomach from the surprises of the last few minutes, the feverish curiosity and excitement was still stronger. "I'm in," I said, "and I'm okay with second place if it also means we don't have to be the first ones to walk into whatever's ahead." "Martina?" She hesitated and chewed at her lip for a moment, but she nodded, and we all began to follow Aaron's bobbing light ahead. It seemed we were all caught between not wanting to lose him and not wanting to get too close, so our pace stuttered between hurried rushes and hesitant, careful pauses. "Hey, Martina," Vicente started. "You said your maps have been trying to lead you here all week, right?" "Yes," she said. "I thought it was just a glitch, but I reinstalled the app and it was still happening. Yesterday, I even switched to a completely different maps app, and tonight, it still sent me here. That's when I couldn't resist anymore." "Oh, whoa," I said. "I didn't try that. That's really weird." Vicente then turned to me. "And you said you've been seeing this happen for a few days too. And since the three of you have been roped into this, it makes sense that others have probably been seeing this too. It seems pretty far-fetched that we're the first ones to come out here." If there's just one winner to this thing, I don't think it's going to be him. Vicente gestured to Aaron's outline ahead of us. That sunk in while we hiked on. The loudest sounds in my ears were our footsteps and my own breath against the backdrop of gentle rainfall. Eventually, I realized it probably wasn't smart to just blindly follow Aaron. I pulled up my own map again, and I stopped in my tracks. "Hey, what's wrong?" Vicente asked. "Martina, you've got your map? Let's compare real quick. It looks to me like we're going the wrong way." "Vicente, make sure you don't lose sight of Aaron, okay?" Martina pulled up her map. We held our phones side by side and both tried to make sense of them. My map was north-oriented and hers south-oriented, so it took a minute, but soon we confirmed that not only did our maps differ from the direction we were going, they also differed from one another. "Shit," she said, looking at me questioningly. "Hey, I think I lost him," Vicente called from up ahead. "Shit," I echoed Martina. "Come on," we hurried up to Vicente. "I'm sorry, man, his light was there 1 second and gone the next," Vicente said. "Hey, Aaron, you still out there?" I yelled out with more bravado than I felt. We all went silent and listened to a response. None came. "He probably decided to ditch us and hurry to the prize," I said to the others. "Seems to me we have 3 choices. We chase after him, we follow my map, or we follow Martina's map." "4 choices," Vicente said. "We could just get out of here." I looked at him skeptically. He wasn't the type to back down from something once he'd started. Before I could say anything, though, Martina spoke up. "No, Noah, this is the most interesting thing to happen to me all year. I want to find out what this is. You're in, right?" she asked of me. "We can follow your map. I don't mind. I don't need to win. I just don't want to always wonder. You know, if Vicente wants to call it, I'll head back," I said, looking to Vicente. "But I'm in to keep going if you are." The truth is, I knew he wouldn't back down if I put it this way. I was just trying to appear noble and considerate. But really all I cared about in that moment was solving the mystery. And just like I thought, Vicente backed me up. He was a really good friend, and I probably didn't deserve him. Let me take an aside here to acknowledge that I've dallied in details that may not seem important to the facts of the story. I think it's because I cherish the opportunity to inhabit that time of my life again, even if only in memory. Life feels different now, worse. I'll try to keep it factual from here on out and not give too much conjecture. I don't want my theories to bias your conclusions about what the rest of this means. We followed my map. I led the way, glancing between the screen and the 10 feet of forest illuminated in front of me by my phone's flashlight. I was hiking fast. Despite not knowing what the hell was really going on here, I felt that I was running out of time. Then my flashlight went out. I looked down at my screen, and it was pure white. I remember my vision kind of shuddered or vibrated. The next thing I remember is catching myself on my hands and knees. I'd tripped over a branch or log. The thing is, I didn't think that I'd even been walking, so how did I trip? I looked around for my friends. I think I had already lumped Martina into that category, but didn't see their lights or hear their footsteps. "Vicente?" I called out. "Martina?" They were gone. My phone was gone. I patted my pockets and searched around me as best I could. The hills, brush, and trees seemed wrong, unfamiliar. I yelled out again, fear and anxiety changing the pitch of my voice. "Vic!" I choked off halfway through Vicente's name when I saw a light off to my left. It was faint and yellow, not the tone of any of the lights the others had been using. Despite that, I started toward it. Every half minute or so I'd stop and peer at the light, trying to judge what it was and whether I was getting any closer to it. The more I examined it, the more odd it seemed. It was a single point of yellow light. Its size hadn't changed despite the time I'd been walking. I couldn't see that it was illuminating anything, which made it very difficult to gauge how far away it was. "Vicente?" I called out again. My body was wetter than I thought it should be, and I was shaking with cold or anxiety or both. I stopped and pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes, rubbing at my head in an attempt to center and calm myself. Goosebumps prickled up my arms when I realized that I could still see that light even with my eyes shut tight. My first thought was that it was a visual burn-in, like the artifact of the sun that you can still see with your eyes closed after glancing at it. But those artifacts would move with your eye. When I looked to the left, the light was to the right. When I looked to the right, the light was to the left. It was in exactly the same position, whether my eyes were open or closed. I looked back the way I had come and faced another shot. This one had me feeling nauseous with a sense of vertigo. I could still see the light, even when it was behind me. I could see behind me, though this new dimension of vision was limited to that steady yellow light. My shiver turned into a violent, seizing chill that brought me to my knees. I tried to focus on the sensation of the damp forest floor between my fingers and get myself together. For a moment I questioned whether I was dreaming, but I knew that I was not. I don't know how long it took me to get back up, but I know that when I did, I headed toward that light. Vicente was out here somewhere, and I had a better chance of finding him wherever I was being led than by walking in another random direction. The rain was falling harder now, and I could hear my feet squelching in my shoes with every step. I continued to take the risk of calling out my friends' names. I even called out for Aaron once in a while. Then the song. It was close. I ran back and forth across the forest floor until I honed in on where it was coming from. I knelt down and found my phone, screen still shining white. How did it get here? I wondered aloud. No, not my phone. The size and texture felt unfamiliar in my hands. The song, instead of ending, redoubled and began to echo around me in a way that felt unnatural, much like it had sounded when we first encountered Martina, only multiplied. From where I stood, I saw at least half a dozen more pale white lights amidst the brush, scattered all around me. Phones. I began walking toward one when I saw a human shape lying at my feet and nearly fell over in surprise. "Hello?" I said, approaching again and shining a light down. It took my brain a moment to process what I was looking at. Not a person, just clothes, but clothing arranged in the shape of an outfit. 2 brown leather shoes with black socks inside them, open ends touching the pant legs of khaki jeans. Above that, a plaid shirt inside a black jacket. The jacket was zipped. There was a necklace, too, a piece of jade on a silver chain. I checked the pants and saw that even the fly was zipped and buttoned. Feeling numb, but knowing now what to look for, I searched and soon found another set of clothes. This set was face down, but otherwise similarly arranged. More quickly now I moved on and searched for, then found, another. Then another. I was urgently searching for and hoping not to find something familiar. I most dreaded seeing the orange and white jacket that Vicente wore so often, including today. I saw a brighter light up on the ground up ahead and went straight for it. I could tell quickly that it was Aaron's clothing. His light was still clipped to the strap of his backpack. I knelt and lifted his jacket where he had done the same before. There was his pistol, still dry and strapped into the holster on his belt. Any lingering hope that this was all a prank or something innocent disappeared in that moment. Grimly, I unsnapped the clasp and drew the pistol. It felt awkward and heavier than expected in my grip. I'd fired one a couple of times long ago, but as far as I knew, different brands had different types of safeties. I couldn't see any obvious switch or button, so I assumed it was ready to fire. I dropped the phone I'd been using face down on the ground and unclipped Aaron's light instead. I held it out in front of me in a slow pan to examine my surroundings and hoped not to see orange. I saw a bit of peach color. A peach dress under a green coat with a knit cap and black tights looking small and shriveled without legs to fill them. I was contemplating the sight, feeling empty, when the yellow light returned. It changed nothing about what was in my actual field of vision, but I could see it behind me. Brighter than before, much brighter. Somehow I could feel that it was close. I took a deep, silent breath and internally counted to 3. Then I spun around, lifting my 2 weapons, the pistol and man-made light. The whole world shuddered. My body went numb and my sense of time broke. I could have been there for half a second or half the night. Then my head was hurting and I was on the ground, blinking my mind back into my body. There was an impression of something large moving very quickly away from me. I felt something under my fingers and grabbed it, pushing myself to my feet and into a desperate, primal run through the dark forest. I remember flashes here. I remember the pain in my throat from breathing so hard. I remember the impact of branches against my skin. I remember hearing a pop in my ankle and tumbling down a slope. then lying there in silence and hoping not to hear the sounds of pursuit. Eventually, I remembered that I was holding something and looked at it. I started crying. It was Vicente's disc, the one we'd been tossing back and forth just a few hours ago. The realization of what must have happened hit me hard, and I cried silently and convulsively for several minutes. Then I got up and started back in the direction I thought I'd come from. I had to go back for him. My now swollen and throbbing ankle slowed me significantly, however, and my sense of direction was completely shot. Nevertheless, I wandered and searched for my friend until dawn, before making the half-conscious decision to get back to civilization. I found a bus that took me close enough to Samara's house to walk the rest of the way. She was the closest person I knew. I held on to hope that we could call Vicente together and he would answer, wondering what the hell had happened to me after we got separated. But he didn't answer. He's never answered again. That was 3 months ago. I filed a missing persons report, but I didn't know how much to say about what happened. I didn't want them to write me off as a nut job and not search. I settled on a version of the truth. That Vicente and I had gone hiking, that we had met 2 others in Forest Park, that I'd gotten separated from them and never saw my friend again. I call every week for an update, but it doesn't seem like that the police are taking it seriously. Vicente's parents are in Mexico. I feel a responsibility to tell them what I know, but I'm certain they won't believe me or find any comfort in what I have to say. I feel like a comforting lie would be the kindest thing, but my conscience won't let me do that. So instead, they're probably worried sick, just as tortured as me. I told Samara and Rob the full truth. But they either straight up don't believe me, or they think I'm traumatized or crazy or something. They haven't plainly told me they don't want to be friends, but they don't call or message me anymore. I've tried to find Martina and Aaron or their families, but so far I've had no luck. I posted on Craigslist and social media, even tried the newspaper. I keep thinking I'll find a news story or poster or something about one of them having gone missing, but nothing. One day on the street, I thought I saw Aaron. I ran up to him and almost said something, but I faltered in doubt when I got close. He looked at me suspiciously, but without recognition, and kept walking. It wasn't him. I don't think it was him. I'm sick, but no doctor has been able to diagnose me. My online research tells me it could be something nebulous like chronic fatigue syndrome, but that has no clear cause or cure. I get rashes, cold sweats in the night. Some days I can hardly get out of bed. I have a lot of trouble concentrating, except for streaks of obsessiveness. It's taken me 2 months to write all this out. I think I'm going to lose my job. I don't know where to go from here, but I felt that I had to get my truth out there. If you know anything about what happened to my friend, please tell me. And please, if you start hearing that song, smash your phone into 1,000 pieces before it takes your life away like it took Vicente's. Like it took mine.